Welcome to Wisdom of the Buddha. Our channel is dedicated to sharing the timeless teachings of the Buddha, offering insights into mindfulness, compassion, and inner peace. Through storytelling, guided meditations, and discussions on Buddhist philosophy, we aim to inspire you on a journey of personal growth and spiritual awakening. Whether you're new to Buddhism or deepening your practice, our videos provide practical wisdom to help you lead a more peaceful and meaningful life. Join us as we explore the path to enlightenment and uncover the ancient wisdom that remains profoundly relevant today. The Sakya dynasty, though relatively small, was known as a powerful and respected realm located in Kapilavastu, in the region that now borders Nepal and India. King Siddhartha and Queen Maya ruled with compassion and fairness, beloved by their people. However, despite their prosperity, there was a profound longing within the royal family, the absence of an heir to continue the lineage and secure the future of their kingdom. The king yearned for a son who would one day succeed him, a prince who could not only rule wisely, but also embody the virtues that he and Queen Maya held dear. One night, Queen Maya had an extraordinary dream that seemed to transcend reality itself. In this vision, a majestic white elephant with 6 tusks descended from the heavens, carrying a lotus flower in its trunk. The elephant entered her side, filling her with an overwhelming sense of peace, purity, and joy. In ancient Indian tradition, such a dream was considered highly auspicious, a divine sign that the child to be born would be of unparalleled greatness. This vision stirred the palace, and the kingdom's sages and astrologers were summoned to interpret its meaning. The sages, who were deeply versed in the ancient scriptures, saw this as a clear prophecy. They proclaimed that the child would either become a world-renowned ruler or, if he renounced worldly life, he would become a great spiritual leader who would bring liberation to countless beings. This prophecy sparked both joy and concern in King Siddhartha's heart. While he was overjoyed at the thought of having an heir, he worried that his son might one day leave the kingdom in search of higher truths. The king and queen's joy was infectious, spreading throughout the kingdom. The people of Kapilavastu shared in the royal family's anticipation, seeing this as a moment of destiny that might bring peace and prosperity to their land. The palace prepared for the birth of this child with a sense of awe and devotion, every chamber adorned in beauty and symbolic offerings placed in the temple as a prayer for a safe and blessed birth. In the context of Buddhist stories, such miraculous signs surrounding the Buddha's birth are not uncommon. They highlight the purity and spiritual power that would characterize the Buddha's life and teachings. Similar narratives can be found across different cultures and spiritual traditions, where divine beings or enlightened figures are often accompanied by supernatural occurrences at their birth. This symbolism serves to underline the unique and transformative role these figures are destined to play in the world. As the story unfolds, it's clear that Prince Siddhartha's life journey would not be one of ordinary royalty. The miracles and signs surrounding his birth foreshadow a path that would lead far beyond the material realm and deeply into the heart of spiritual wisdom. His life would bring answers to the suffering and challenges that every being faces, a legacy that has endured for over 2,500 years. The story of Prince Siddhartha's birth is one of beauty, divine signs, and a sacred atmosphere, marking the arrival of a soul destined for greatness. His mother, Queen Maya, was on her way to her hometown when she stopped in the lush garden of Lumbini. The garden was a place of tranquility, filled with fragrant flowers and the sounds of birds. Under the canopy of a sal tree, surrounded by nature's gentle beauty, she gave birth to her son, Siddhartha. This event would forever transform the lives of those around him, beginning a path that would ultimately lead to enlightenment. Legends say that at the moment of his birth, Siddhartha possessed a unique aura that radiated around him, casting a soft glow. Witnesses were captivated by his unusual beauty and calm presence, sensing that this child was unlike any other. Even the natural surroundings seemed to honor his birth. Flowers bloomed more vibrantly, a soft breeze carried the scent of blossoms, and the creatures in the forest remained still, as if paying silent homage. At this moment, the sages and seers who were called upon to examine the newborn's fortune saw in him a life of dual possibilities. They proclaimed that this child was destined to become either a great king who would bring peace and prosperity to the world, or a spiritual leader who would guide humanity to liberation. The king, overjoyed but also apprehensive, hoped his son would follow the path of rulership and ensure the kingdom's stability and legacy. But fate, as seen by those wise in spiritual matters, often has its own course. In Buddhism, Siddhartha's birth is marked by tales that reflect his spiritual purpose. According to legend, as soon as he was born, Siddhartha took 7 steps in each of the 4 cardinal directions, symbolizing his future mission to spread wisdom and compassion across the world. With each step, a lotus flower bloomed beneath his feet, a profound image of purity, beauty, and the beginning of a transformative journey. This symbol of the lotus, emerging unsoiled from the mud, became a metaphor for the Buddhist path, rising above the suffering of the world to achieve spiritual purity. One well-known story that relates to Siddhartha's early life concerns Asita, a sage who visited the palace shortly after Siddhartha's birth. Asita looked upon the infant and wept, astonishing the royal family. When asked why he was crying, Asita explained that he wept not out of sorrow, but out of bittersweet joy. He foresaw that Siddhartha would leave the royal life to become a spiritual teacher, guiding countless beings toward liberation. Asita felt gratitude for witnessing the birth of such a soul, but he also lamented that he was too old to follow Siddhartha when he eventually taught the Dharma, the path to enlightenment. The anticipation surrounding Siddhartha's potential was not only present in his family, but also spread through the kingdom. People sensed a transformative power in the young prince, and stories of his birth spread far and wide. The mythological narratives, like those of Asita and the blooming lotus, served to illustrate the qualities that Siddhartha would embody: compassion, wisdom, and a determination to understand the nature of existence. In many Buddhist accounts, the presence of these auspicious signs is meant to communicate to followers that the Buddha's journey was preordained and divinely blessed. His birth story reflects not only the significance of his life, but also the values he would come to embody: simplicity, purity, and selflessness. Unlike many other rulers or religious figures, Siddhartha's life would be marked not by conquest or the accumulation of power, but by a relentless pursuit of truth and liberation for all beings. The birth of Siddhartha set in motion a life that would challenge the expectations of his family and the traditions of his time. In the coming chapters of his life, the young prince would explore the pleasures and privileges of royal life, but he would remain haunted by a sense of something greater, a yearning for understanding that no luxury could satisfy. Thus, Siddhartha's story begins with this miraculous birth, heralded by sages and celebrated by his people. It is a story that reminds us of the potential for greatness and compassion in each of us, inspiring generations to look beyond worldly pursuits and seek deeper truths. The birth of Prince Siddhartha marks not just the arrival of a spiritual leader, but the beginning of a journey that would illuminate a path for countless others to follow. The tale of the sage Asita is one of deep spiritual insight and bittersweet foresight, painting a profound picture of Siddhartha's destiny. Asita, an aged sage who had long retreated from the trappings of the world, was highly respected for his wisdom and understanding of spiritual matters. News of Siddhartha's birth reached Asita in his hermitage, and he felt a compelling urge to visit the newborn prince, sensing that this child bore an extraordinary significance. Upon entering the royal palace, Asita was greeted with reverence and led to where the infant Siddhartha lay. The sage observed the child intently, noting a rare serenity and depth in the baby's gaze, as though he already possessed a deep awareness of the world. As Asita held Siddhartha in his arms, he was overcome with emotion and began to weep. His tears surprised and worried those around him, who thought he might be foreseeing a tragic future for the prince. When asked why he wept, Asita explained his bittersweet vision. He revealed that Siddhartha was destined not for the throne, but for a path of spiritual awakening, one that would lead him to renounce worldly life in search of higher truths. Asita, having spent his life in pursuit of spiritual understanding, recognized in Siddhartha the potential to achieve the enlightenment he himself had always sought. Yet, there was sadness in Asita's heart, for he knew he was too old to witness the prince's journey and teachings. He mourned that he would not be alive to follow Siddhartha and learn from the wisdom he would one day offer. In Buddhist lore, the story of Asita's prophecy holds deep significance. It highlights the struggle between worldly power and spiritual liberation, themes that would define Siddhartha's life. Despite his father King Suddhodana's hopes that Siddhartha would grow into a great ruler, Asita's prophecy suggested a different calling, one that would take Siddhartha far from the comforts and responsibilities of palace life. This prophecy set the stage for Siddhartha's internal conflict and the eventual realization of his purpose. The legend of Asita resonates with the Buddhist principle of dukkha, the concept that even in the midst of joy, there is an underlying sorrow or incompleteness, a reminder that everything in the material world is transient. Asita's tears were not just for his own unrealized spiritual aspirations, but also for the inevitability of Siddhartha's departure from the palace and the life of luxury that awaited him. To those who understand the teachings of Buddhism, Asita's encounter with the infant prince symbolizes the realization that true contentment cannot be found in worldly achievements, but rather in transcending them. As Siddhartha grew, Asita's prophecy lingered in the minds of the royal family. King Suddhodana, determined to prevent his son from choosing the spiritual path, surrounded Siddhartha with luxuries and distractions, hoping to anchor him in palace life. However, Asita's vision foreshadowed an inner calling in Siddhartha that could not be quieted by wealth or power. It was the seed of a great journey, an inevitable quest for understanding that would ultimately lead him to renounce everything he had been given. The story of Asita also reflects a recurring theme in Buddhism, the role of wise figures and spiritual teachers who appear in moments of significance, offering guidance and insight to those on the path of enlightenment. Although Asita himself was unable to attain the full realization he yearned for, his meeting with Siddhartha was an act of selflessness. He offered his wisdom, knowing it might one day support the prince on his path. In many ways, Asita represents those who have sought spiritual understanding and have paved the way for others to find their own path to awakening. In Buddhist history, many teachers and sages are said to have guided their followers in similar ways, lighting the way with wisdom and compassion. These figures serve as reminders that even the greatest journeys often begin with the insights and encouragement of those who came before. As Siddhartha grew and eventually embarked on his quest for enlightenment, the memory of Asita's prophecy would become a touchstone, reminding him of the transience of worldly joys and the importance of seeking the truth beyond appearances. For those who study Buddhism, the story of Asita and Siddhartha is a testament to the power of insight and compassion. It teaches that even a momentary encounter can influence a lifetime, and that wisdom, once shared, becomes a living part of the journey for generations. The early years of Siddhartha's life were marked by unparalleled luxury and comfort. King Siddhartha, driven by a fierce desire to protect his son from the suffering of the world, spared no expense in creating an environment of sheer opulence within the palace walls. The young prince was shielded from anything that could cause him sorrow, pain, or distress. His days were filled with indulgence, pleasure, and entertainment, each moment crafted to distract him from the harsh realities outside the palace. The palace itself was a grand structure, adorned with fine tapestries, gold, and intricate carvings that symbolized the wealth and power of the Sakya kingdom. Beautiful gardens surrounded the royal compound, and the air was always fragrant with flowers. Siddhartha had every imaginable luxury at his disposal: splendid clothes, exquisite food, and entertainment in abundance. The finest musicians, dancers, and artisans from the kingdom were invited to perform for him, and every whim of the young prince was met with eagerness and devotion by the palace servants. King Siddhartha's hope was clear. By keeping Siddhartha within these walls of luxury and comfort, the prince would never experience the suffering of the outside world, and thus he would never desire to leave his royal life behind. The king was determined to protect his son from any form of discomfort or disillusionment, believing that a life of pleasure and power would ensure Siddhartha's future as a mighty ruler. He arranged for Siddhartha to grow up in an environment where everything was perfect, where every need was fulfilled and every wish was granted. But despite the king's best efforts, Siddhartha's heart was restless. Even in the midst of such extravagance, he felt a deep, inexplicable longing for something more. The beautiful palace, while a paradise of worldly pleasures, was still a gilded cage. The prince, who was growing increasingly aware of his surroundings, began to sense that something was missing. Although the material comforts were endless, his heart yearned for a deeper understanding of life, one that could not be satisfied by wealth, status, or luxury. As Siddhartha matured, his father began to intensify his efforts to protect him from the unpleasant realities of life. The king took extreme measures to shield his son from any exposure to old age, sickness, and death, the three universal marks of human suffering that are central to the Buddhist understanding of dukkha. He even ordered that the roads leading to the city be cleared of the elderly, sick, or anyone who might look distressed, so that Siddhartha would never see them. The young prince was led to believe that such suffering was a distant and irrelevant part of the world. Yet, despite the king's deliberate isolation of his son from the harsh realities of life, Siddhartha's curiosity about the world continued to grow. The palace, no matter how splendid, could not offer him the answers to the questions that stirred in his soul. The luxury of his surroundings was unable to fill the void he felt inside, a void that seemed to grow larger with every passing day. His heart was seeking something that could not be provided by material wealth or royal privilege. In Buddhist teachings, this part of Siddhartha's life is often seen as symbolic of the deeper dissatisfaction that arises from the pursuit of worldly pleasures. While Siddhartha's experiences in the palace may seem ideal on the surface, they reflect the fundamental human condition of longing and discontentment. The Buddha himself later taught that life in the cycle of samsara, driven by desire, attachment, and ignorance, inevitably leads to dissatisfaction, no matter how much material wealth one possesses. A famous story that illustrates this truth is that of the four sights, when Siddhartha, in his adulthood, ventured outside the palace for the first time. During this outing, he encountered an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a wandering ascetic. These sights profoundly shook Siddhartha, as he had never before seen such suffering. The encounter with the sick, old, and dead left a lasting impression on him, as he realized that suffering was an inescapable part of human existence, regardless of wealth or status. In this story, the Buddha's awakening comes not just from seeing these images, but from realizing the impermanence of life and the inevitable suffering that comes with it. This is a crucial moment in Siddhartha's journey, as it marks the beginning of his realization that luxury and comfort, while alluring, could never provide him with true peace or fulfillment. This awakening set him on the path of renunciation and the search for the ultimate truth. In Buddhist philosophy, the idea of dukkha, often translated as suffering or dissatisfaction, is central to understanding the human condition. Siddhartha's life in the palace, though outwardly perfect, was in many ways a reflection of the illusion that worldly pleasures and comforts can provide lasting happiness. The constant striving for more wealth, more pleasure, more success, is seen as a source of suffering, as it creates attachment to fleeting things that are, by their very nature, impermanent. Through Siddhartha's story, Buddhism teaches that true peace and contentment come not from external possessions or achievements, but from understanding the impermanent nature of life and cultivating inner wisdom. Siddhartha's realization of this would eventually lead him to abandon the luxuries of the palace in search of a higher truth, a truth that transcended material wealth and status. His journey would become a beacon for all who seek liberation from the cycle of suffering, teaching that true freedom is found in letting go of attachment and embracing the impermanence of life. The story of Siddhartha's early life is a reminder that no matter how perfect our external circumstances may seem, true happiness cannot be found in the accumulation of wealth or power. It is only by transcending the illusions of the material world and looking inward that we can discover the peace that lies beyond desire. This is the essence of the Buddha's teachings, which continue to inspire millions of people around the world to seek the deeper truths of existence. As Siddhartha grew into adulthood, he became known not only for his physical beauty, but also for his intelligence, wisdom, and noble nature. His life of luxury continued under the watchful eyes of his father, King Suddhodana, who hoped that Siddhartha would eventually assume the throne of the Sakya kingdom. But Siddhartha, though aware of his royal duties, felt a deep sense of restlessness within him, a longing for something greater than the comforts and pleasures offered by his life in the palace. At the age of 16, Siddhartha was married to Yasodhara, a princess from the neighboring kingdom of Kaliya. Yasodhara was known for her beauty, grace, and moral integrity, making her an ideal match for the young prince. Their marriage was not only a union of love, but also a reflection of the high expectations placed on Siddhartha's future as a ruler. Together, they lived in happiness, surrounded by the splendor of the royal court. King Suddhodana, in his desire to provide for his son and daughter-in-law, built 3 magnificent palaces for them, one for the summer, one for the rainy season, and one for the winter. These palaces were the epitome of luxury and comfort, designed to keep Siddhartha and Yasodhara free from the harshness of the seasons and the challenges of life outside. Within these palaces, Siddhartha and Yasodhara enjoyed a life of ease, with every material need met. They had servants to attend to their every wish, beautiful gardens to wander through, and an abundance of entertainment. Siddhartha, now a man, began to embrace his role as a husband and a future king, while Yasodhara, ever the supportive and loving wife, took care of the household and became a steady companion in the prince's life. The couple's happiness was further blessed with the birth of their son, Rahula. The arrival of a son was seen as a sign of continuity for the royal family, ensuring that the legacy of the Sakya dynasty would be carried on. For a while, Siddhartha's life seemed perfect. He was a devoted husband and father, living in the comforts of his splendid palaces, surrounded by everything he could desire. Yet, despite the external joy of his marriage and family, a sense of inner dissatisfaction began to grow within Siddhartha. His life, though filled with pleasure, continued to feel incomplete. The more he enjoyed his life of material abundance, the more he realized that these pleasures did not provide the lasting peace or fulfillment he sought. Siddhartha's awareness of the impermanence of life began to surface, and he could not ignore the fact that no matter how perfect his surroundings or how joyful his family life, death and suffering were inevitable parts of human existence. This realization, which would later lead him to his decision to leave the palace, marked a turning point in his life. A well-known story that reflects Siddhartha's growing awareness of the world beyond his palace is that of the 4 sights, a pivotal moment in his journey toward enlightenment. It is said that one day, after years of living in the protective bubble of the royal palace, Siddhartha requested permission to leave the compound. King Suddhodana, always concerned about keeping his son insulated from the suffering of the world, initially hesitated but eventually allowed the prince to take a brief journey outside the palace gates. On his journey, Siddhartha encountered 4 sights that profoundly altered the course of his life: an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a wandering ascetic. The first sight, an elderly man struggling with the ravages of old age, filled Siddhartha with confusion and sadness. He had never seen anyone so frail before, and this sight shattered the illusion that youth and vitality last forever. The second sight, a man writhing in pain from illness, revealed to him the fragility of the human body. Siddhartha began to understand that sickness, too, was an inescapable part of the human condition. The third sight, a funeral procession, left him deeply shaken as he witnessed the inevitability of death. He had never truly considered that death might come to all, even those in the prime of life. Finally, the fourth sight, that of a peaceful and serene ascetic, intrigued Siddhartha. Here was a man who had renounced the pleasures of the world in search of a higher truth. This sight stirred something within Siddhartha's heart, a recognition that there might be more to life than wealth, pleasure, and even family. At that moment, Siddhartha realized that no matter how much he loved his wife and son, and no matter how rich and prosperous his life was, he could not ignore the universal suffering of aging, illness, and death. This insight would eventually lead him to make the fateful decision to leave his family and the palace in search of spiritual truth and liberation from suffering. In Buddhist teachings, this moment of realization is considered crucial in the path to enlightenment. The Buddha's teachings emphasize that attachment to the material world and its pleasures is a source of suffering because everything is impermanent. The Buddha's life story demonstrates that true fulfillment does not come from external achievements or possessions, but from understanding the nature of existence and liberating oneself from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. While Siddhartha's marriage to Yasodhara was filled with love and devotion, it also highlights the tension between worldly attachments and spiritual aspirations. Yasodhara, like many in the Buddhist tradition, later became an important figure in her own right, exemplifying the qualities of patience, wisdom, and compassion. She too understood that life, though beautiful, is impermanent, and that true peace comes from inner freedom. One famous story from Buddhist tradition tells of Yasodhara's profound faith and wisdom after Siddhartha's departure. It is said that Yasodhara, though devastated by his leaving, never blamed him. Instead, she prayed for his success on his spiritual journey. Her steadfastness and inner strength reflect the deep wisdom that is a part of the Buddhist path. This story underscores the importance of renunciation, not as a rejection of love or family, but as a choice to seek liberation from suffering for the benefit of all beings. The teachings of the Buddha often reflect the delicate balance between attachment and detachment. Through the story of Siddhartha's marriage to Yasodhara, we see the Buddha's own journey as one of transcending the material world in order to discover deeper truths. Love, family, and human connection are not seen as obstacles on the path to enlightenment, but rather as experiences that can deepen one's understanding of the impermanent nature of life. Ultimately, the story of Siddhartha and Yasodhara reminds us that true freedom comes not from avoiding attachments, but from understanding them and learning to let go of the desire for permanence in a world that is constantly changing. As Siddhartha's journey toward enlightenment continues, it is clear that his love for Yasodhara and his family will remain an integral part of his life. The Buddha's teachings, which emphasize compassion for all beings, reflect this deep understanding that while one may walk the path of renunciation, love and compassion for others remain at the heart of spiritual practice. Siddhartha's sheltered life within the royal palace had kept him shielded from the harsh realities of the world. The lavish surroundings, the comfort, and the constant indulgence in pleasure were all part of his father's strategy to keep him from questioning his fate as the future king. King Siddhartha believed that if his son remained ignorant of the suffering outside the palace walls, he would be content to inherit the throne and rule over the Sakya people, living a life of power, wealth, and security. However, despite the king's efforts, Siddhartha felt an increasing sense of dissatisfaction and inner turmoil. He could not shake the feeling that something was missing, that the life of luxury he had been given could not offer him the ultimate peace and understanding he sought. His heart yearned for something deeper, something beyond the fleeting joys of the material world. And so, one day, he convinced his father to allow him to leave the confines of the palace and venture outside into the world. This was the beginning of what would become a profound and transformative journey for Siddhartha. Over the course of 4 trips outside the palace walls, Siddhartha would witness the realities of aging, sickness, death, and the pursuit of spiritual wisdom, sights that would shake him to his core and inspire him to seek a path of true liberation. On his first journey, Siddhartha came across an elderly man. The man's body was frail, his hair thin and gray, and his face lined with the marks of time. Siddhartha had never seen such a person before. He was struck by the man's helplessness and the inevitability of aging. It was a shocking realization for the young prince, who had lived in the illusion of perpetual youth and vitality. This encounter stirred within him a deep understanding that aging, and the decay that comes with it, was an unavoidable part of the human experience. Siddhartha began to question the meaning of life if it was destined to end in such frailty. On his second journey, Siddhartha witnessed a scene of illness. He saw a person writhing in pain, suffering from a disease. The sight filled him with great sorrow, as he realized that sickness was another unavoidable part of human life. In the comfort of the palace, Siddhartha had never been exposed to such suffering. But now, seeing it firsthand, he understood that health was not a guarantee, and all beings were vulnerable to the ravages of illness. The prince began to grasp the truth of impermanence. Nothing, not even the body, could remain unchanged. His third journey led him to a funeral procession, where he saw the body of a dead man being carried away. The sight of death struck Siddhartha with immense grief and shock. Death was the ultimate unknown, the final destination for all living beings. It was a universal truth that no one could escape. Siddhartha had never before faced the reality of death, having been protected from it all his life. But now, he was forced to confront the fact that no matter how rich, powerful, or beautiful a person might be, death would come for everyone. This sight deeply disturbed him, for it forced him to confront the fleeting nature of all things. Finally, on his fourth and last journey, Siddhartha encountered a wandering ascetic, a man who had renounced worldly possessions and pleasures in search of spiritual enlightenment. This sight provided a stark contrast to the previous three. The ascetic appeared calm, serene, and free from the burdens of the world. Siddhartha was moved by the ascetic's peace and tranquility. The man had chosen to live a life of self-discipline and contemplation, seeking to understand the nature of existence and transcend the suffering of the world. This encounter sparked a new realization in Siddhartha, a possibility that he had never considered before. If aging, sickness, and death were unavoidable, then the path of worldly pleasures and power could not lead to ultimate fulfillment. Perhaps the only way to find true peace was through renunciation, through seeking a deeper understanding of life's true nature. These four sights became the turning point in Siddhartha's life. The shocking realization that aging, illness, and death were inevitable, coupled with the possibility of transcending suffering through spiritual practice, awakened within him a burning desire to seek a path of liberation. He realized that the comforts of the palace, the pleasures of the material world, and even his family and status could not provide lasting happiness or peace. The only way to overcome the suffering inherent in life was to find a path that led beyond the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, the cycle of samsara. Siddhartha's reaction to the four sights is deeply significant in the Buddhist tradition, as it is often seen as the moment when he first realized the fundamental truths of human existence. These truths, which would later form the core of his teachings, are the truth of suffering, dukkha, the truth of the cause of suffering, samadaya, the truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, magga. One of the most well-known Buddhist stories that echoes this moment of realization is the story of the Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Just as Siddhartha was moved by the four sights, the Buddha's enlightenment is seen as the ultimate understanding of these same truths. The Buddha's path to awakening was one of renunciation, meditation, and insight into the nature of suffering and the impermanence of all things. His teachings on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path became a guide for millions of people seeking freedom from suffering. There is also the story of the Buddha's first sermon, delivered in the Deer Park to the 5 ascetics, who had once been his companions. In this sermon, the Buddha expounded on the 4 Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, teaching that suffering was an inevitable part of life, but that through understanding its causes and following the path of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline, one could attain liberation from suffering. Through these teachings, the Buddha demonstrated that the realization of suffering is not a cause for despair, but a call to action, a call to seek a way out of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The 4 sights were Siddhartha's first encounter with the truths of existence, and they set him on the path to becoming the Buddha, the awakened one. His life and teachings inspire countless people today to look beyond the surface of life and seek the deeper truths that can lead to liberation from suffering. As Siddhartha's journey toward enlightenment continued, these 4 sights remained with him, guiding him in his quest for wisdom. They also remind us, in the modern world, to acknowledge the suffering and impermanence of life and to seek a path that leads to peace, not through worldly achievement, but through inner understanding and spiritual awakening. After witnessing the 4 sights, the elderly, the sick, the dead, and the ascetic, Siddhartha's life was forever transformed. The once content prince, surrounded by every material comfort, now felt a profound emptiness deep within his soul. Despite all the luxuries and pleasures at his disposal, Siddhartha realized that worldly happiness could not provide lasting peace or freedom. He came to understand that suffering, impermanence, and death were inevitable truths of life that no amount of wealth or status could escape. These truths stirred within him an unshakable desire to seek a deeper, more meaningful existence. His decision to leave the palace was not one made lightly. Siddhartha loved his family deeply, particularly his wife, Yasodhara, and his newborn son, Rahula. Yet, the pull of the truth was stronger than any attachment to the comforts of royal life. The image of suffering, the very suffering he had witnessed in the world outside the palace, was now etched in his heart. His mind was set. He must leave everything behind and embark on a journey to discover the true path to liberation from suffering, not only for himself, but for all beings trapped in the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. One night, Siddhartha made his decision. He quietly rose from his bed, kissed his wife and son, and left the palace without a word, stepping into the darkness of the world outside. This moment marked the beginning of his spiritual quest, often referred to as the Great Renunciation. It was a journey of profound self-discovery, one that would lead him to find the ultimate answers to the questions of suffering and existence. Siddhartha's departure from the palace is deeply significant in the Buddhist tradition. It symbolizes the renunciation of worldly attachments, the rejection of wealth, power, and even familial love in the pursuit of truth. By leaving his home, Siddhartha demonstrated that the pursuit of enlightenment requires a willingness to let go of all that is familiar and comforting. It is not a rejection of love, but rather a deep recognition that love, as beautiful as it is, cannot shield one from the suffering inherent in the world. The Buddha's journey of renunciation has been described in many ways, but one of the most famous stories from the early stages of his search for enlightenment is his encounter with the ascetic practices. Siddhartha, determined to find the path to liberation, sought out various spiritual teachers and followed different paths of asceticism. He practiced severe austerities, including fasting, sitting for long hours in meditation, and engaging in physical penance. The path of extreme self-mortification was a common spiritual practice of the time, and Siddhartha, in his relentless pursuit of the truth, embraced it with unwavering dedication. However, Siddhartha's practice of extreme asceticism eventually led him to a realization. Self-mortification, though a form of discipline, did not lead to enlightenment. In fact, it weakened the body and clouded the mind, preventing him from achieving true insight. This realization led him to abandon the path of self-harm and embrace a more balanced approach, one that would eventually become known as the middle way, a path of moderation between the extremes of indulgence and asceticism. Siddhartha's story of renunciation can be seen as a powerful lesson in Buddhist teachings about the nature of attachment and the pursuit of spiritual truth. By leaving behind his royal life and the comforts of family and wealth, Siddhartha showed that material attachments, though not inherently evil, ultimately bind one to the cycle of suffering samsara. Through the Buddha's example, we learn that true freedom comes not from seeking external sources of happiness, but from understanding and transcending the internal sources of suffering that arise from our attachments, desires, and ignorance. One story that echoes this theme is that of the Buddha's encounter with Mara, the embodiment of desire and temptation. After Siddhartha had made his decision to seek enlightenment, he entered deep meditation under the Bodhi tree. During his meditation, Mara, the demon of illusion, attempted to distract and derail him from his quest. Mara offered Siddhartha everything he had once desired: power, wealth, sensual pleasures, but Siddhartha, undisturbed, rejected all of these temptations. He understood that these fleeting pleasures could never satisfy the deeper longing for inner peace and freedom. Mara's temptations represent the distractions and attachments that keep beings trapped in samsara, and Siddhartha's rejection of Mara symbolizes the Buddha's realization that liberation comes only through renouncing these desires and attachments. Another important aspect of Siddhartha's journey was his encounter with the teachings of the great spiritual masters of his time. He studied under renowned teachers such as Alara Lama and Uddaka Ramaputta, who offered him valuable insights into meditation and the nature of reality. However, even after mastering their teachings, Siddhartha felt that he had not yet attained the final liberation. This dissatisfaction with the teachings of others led him to strike out on his own, independent of all external authorities and doctrines. In his search for truth, Siddhartha's commitment to personal experience, rather than relying solely on the wisdom of others, is a key component of his spiritual path. At the heart of Siddhartha's quest was the desire to understand the nature of suffering and how it could be transcended. He realized that to truly understand suffering, one must experience it directly, not through the comforts of wealth and indulgence, but through the discipline of meditation, insight, and renunciation. This would lead him to the discovery of the Four Noble Truths and the path to liberation. The Buddha's journey to enlightenment is filled with profound insights, each of which points to a deeper understanding of the nature of life and suffering. One story that illustrates this is the parable of the burning house, told by the Buddha to explain the nature of desire. In the story, a father has a house that is on fire, and he calls his children to come out. However, the children are so attached to the toys inside that they refuse to leave. The father, seeing that they will not leave voluntarily, offers them even more enticing toys to lure them out of the burning house. In this story, the burning house represents the world of samsara, with all its attachments and illusions. The toys represent the pleasures and distractions that keep beings trapped in this cycle of suffering. The Father's call to his children symbolizes the Buddha's invitation to all beings to abandon these distractions and seek the true refuge of enlightenment. Siddhartha's resolve to find the truth is a message for all beings, regardless of their station in life or the attachments they hold. It is a reminder that true peace and liberation come not from external possessions, but from inner understanding and the ability to free oneself from the endless cycle of desire and suffering. Through his story, Siddhartha teaches that the pursuit of truth requires courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to awakening. In his search for the truth, Siddhartha's journey would lead him to the Bodhi tree, where, after years of struggle and contemplation, he would finally attain enlightenment. This moment would mark the culmination of his quest and the beginning of his teachings to the world, teachings that would offer a path to liberation for all those who sought it. As the Buddha's teachings spread far and wide, an ever-growing number of people from all walks of life sought to understand and follow the path he had laid out. From kings and merchants to common villagers and outcasts, the Buddha's message resonated with a vast and diverse audience. His teachings transcended social, cultural, and economic boundaries, offering a path of liberation to all who were willing to listen, regardless of their status or background. One of the remarkable aspects of the Buddha's teaching was his ability to speak to people in ways that were relevant to their own lives and experiences. He never imposed rigid doctrines or abstract concepts, but instead tailored his teachings to the individual, using parables, analogies, and simple yet profound wisdom that anyone could grasp. The Buddha understood that human beings, regardless of their position in life, share a common experience of suffering, and his teachings provided a way to address that suffering through understanding, compassion, and mindfulness. One of the most famous examples of the Buddha's ability to teach to diverse audiences is the story of his encounter with the rich merchant, Anathapindika. Anathapindika was a wealthy and influential man who had already heard of the Buddha's teachings and was eager to meet him. Upon meeting the Buddha, Anathapindika asked, "What is the path that leads to the cessation of suffering?" The Buddha's response was simple yet profound. "The path is to abandon greed, hatred, and delusion, and to cultivate generosity, compassion, and wisdom." Anathapindika, already a generous man, found these teachings deeply resonant and soon became one of the Buddha's greatest lay supporters, using his wealth to build monasteries and support the Sangha. His story is an important lesson about how the Buddha's teachings are not limited to monks or ascetics, but can be embraced by all, regardless of their material wealth or social standing. The Buddha's teachings on the nature of suffering, its causes, and the path to liberation were foundational to his entire message. One of the core principles he taught was the law of karma, which states that our actions, words, and thoughts have consequences that shape our experiences and the world around us. This idea of cause and effect is central to the Buddha's philosophy, and it helps explain how suffering arises and how it can be overcome. According to the Buddha, suffering is a natural part of existence, but it is not something we must passively endure. By understanding the law of karma, we can take responsibility for our actions and work to create the conditions for peace, happiness, and liberation. A well-known story of how the Buddha taught the principle of karma involves a man named Kunda. Kunda was a blacksmith who, after hearing of the Buddha's teachings, invited him to a meal at his home. The Buddha accepted the invitation, but during the meal, Kunda served food that was tainted and caused the Buddha to become ill. Afterward, Kunda felt deeply distressed, believing that he had committed an offense by feeding the Buddha something harmful. The Buddha, however, reassured him by explaining that no harm had been done, and that the cause of his illness was not the food itself, but the karma that had been created in the past. The Buddha used this opportunity to teach Kunda that one's actions in the past create the conditions for future experiences, and that the present moment is an opportunity to purify past karma through right action and wisdom. The Buddha also taught the importance of mindfulness and the cultivation of wisdom in everyday life. He did not emphasize renunciation of the world, but instead encouraged people to engage fully in life while remaining detached from the fleeting desires and distractions that lead to suffering. One of the most famous stories illustrating this teaching is the parable of the poisoned arrow. In this parable, the Buddha explains that when someone is struck by a poisoned arrow, their primary concern should be to remove the poison and tend to the wound, rather than engage in useless debates about the identity of the archer or the type of poison. In the same way, the Buddha taught that the focus of one's practice should be on the immediate work of eliminating suffering and ignorance, rather than getting caught up in abstract philosophical questions that do not lead to liberation. A particularly important aspect of the Buddha's teachings was the emphasis on compassion, or karuna, for all living beings. The Buddha believed that compassion is not just an emotional response, but a conscious and deliberate effort to reduce the suffering of others. Compassion is at the heart of the Buddhist path and is essential for one's own spiritual development. One of the Buddha's most famous teachings on compassion is the Metta Sutta, a discourse in which the Buddha taught his followers to cultivate loving kindness towards all beings, regardless of their background or behavior. The Buddha's practice of compassion extended not only to humans, but also to animals and all sentient beings, teaching that true spiritual progress is measured by one's ability to act with kindness and understanding in all circumstances. The Buddha's ability to connect with people from all walks of life was also evident in his approach to the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns. In the beginning, the Buddha's followers were mostly men, but as his teachings spread, women also sought to join the Sangha. The Buddha was often approached by women seeking spiritual refuge, and in each case, he responded with great compassion and wisdom. One of the most famous stories involving a woman was the case of Queen Malika, who was initially hesitant to enter the monastic community because of her royal status. When she sought the Buddha's guidance, he told her that the true path to liberation was not determined by one's social status, but by one's inner qualities. Queen Malika was deeply moved by the Buddha's words, and she went on to become a devoted practitioner, demonstrating that the path to enlightenment is open to all, regardless of gender or social standing. The Buddha's teachings on compassion were also evident in his response to people who had wronged or harmed others. Rather than condemning them, the Buddha would often teach them the consequences of their actions and offer them a path to redemption. One of the most profound examples of this approach is the story of Angulimala, a notorious bandit who had killed many people and was feared by all. When Angulimala encountered the Buddha, he was so moved by the Buddha's presence that he immediately sought refuge in his teachings. The Buddha, without fear or judgment, welcomed him into the community and taught him the path of redemption. Angulimala went on to become a monk and a devoted follower of the Buddha, illustrating that no one is beyond the possibility of transformation, no matter their past actions. In addition to teaching about compassion, wisdom, and karma, the Buddha also emphasized the importance of personal experience in spiritual practice. He encouraged his followers to question everything and to investigate his teachings for themselves. He often used the analogy of the goldsmith, who does not rely on the opinions of others, but carefully tests the purity of gold by heating and refining it. In the same way, the Buddha urged his followers to test the teachings through their own practice and experience, rather than relying on blind faith or tradition. As the Buddha continued to teach and share his wisdom, his message gained more followers. His community, the Sangha, grew into a vibrant and diverse group of monks, nuns, and lay followers. People from all walks of life found solace in the Buddha's teachings, and his influence continued to spread across the Indian subcontinent. His teachings continue to inspire millions of people around the world, demonstrating the universal appeal of the path to liberation that he offered. The Buddha's approach to teaching was one of inclusivity, compassion, and direct experience. His ability to communicate profound spiritual truths in simple, accessible ways allowed his message to transcend time and place, reaching people from all walks of life. Today, the Buddha's teachings continue to provide a guide for individuals seeking to live a life of wisdom, compassion, and freedom from suffering. After years of wandering and teaching, the Buddha returned to his homeland, Kapilavastu, a place that once held the memories of his privileged life as Prince Siddhartha. The return was marked with a profound sense of completion, as the journey of enlightenment, which began under the Bodhi tree, had now culminated in this full-circle moment. The Buddha's reunion with his family, his father, King Suddhodana, his mother, Queen Maya, who had passed away earlier, but whose memory still lingered in the hearts of the people, and his son, Rahula, was both a moment of personal reflection and spiritual teaching. The Buddha's return to his family was a poignant reminder of his renunciation of worldly attachments, yet it also symbolized his deep compassion and the possibility of transformation for all beings, including his own kin. His father, King Suddhodana, although initially reluctant to accept his son's path, had come to respect and honor his journey. In the presence of his son, now the Buddha, the king felt both a profound sense of pride and sorrow. Pride, because Siddhartha had become the enlightened one, and sorrow, because of the sacrifices that had been made, including the separation between father and son. However, the king's love for his son was tempered by the understanding that his son had not only transcended the ordinary human struggles, but had now come back to offer the teachings of liberation for all. The Buddha, being the compassionate teacher that he was, did not ignore the feelings of his family. He offered them the same teachings that had led him to enlightenment, and in doing so, gave them an opportunity for their own spiritual liberation. In his teachings to his father, the Buddha highlighted the importance of detachment and impermanence, explaining that the attachment to worldly things, whether power, wealth, or even family, is the root cause of suffering. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence are a central aspect of his message, one that encourages us to recognize the fleeting nature of all things and to focus on the cultivation of wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness in the present moment. An important lesson in this chapter of the Buddha's life is the way he addressed the concept of family and responsibility. His return to his father's house was not simply to reconnect with his past life, but to help his family understand the deeper truths that had become the foundation of his path. The Buddha's teachings were not about renouncing family or responsibilities, but about transcending attachment to them. He encouraged his family members to embrace the truth of the present moment and to recognize that suffering arises from attachment to the transient world. The Buddha's compassionate approach offered a path to peace for his family, one that would allow them to embrace the wisdom of the Dharma while continuing to fulfill their roles in society. The Buddha's son, Rahula, was perhaps the most poignant recipient of his father's teachings during this return. Rahula, a young boy at the time, had been left behind by his father when Siddhartha left the palace in search of truth. Rahula had grown up without his father's presence, and when he finally met the Buddha, he was eager to learn from him. The Buddha, recognizing Rahula's sincere wish to understand, took him in as a disciple and taught him the importance of mindfulness and right action. Rahula's journey to enlightenment, as the Buddha's son, was both a personal and symbolic one, showing that the path to liberation is open to all, regardless of their familial ties. One of the most significant moments in Rahula's life, as detailed in the texts, came when the Buddha explained to him the importance of self-reflection and self-discipline. The Buddha used a metaphor to explain this lesson. Just as a person would be careful when handling a fragile vessel or a priceless jewel, one must also be careful with their own actions, speech, and thoughts. These are the tools through which you will either perpetuate suffering or pave the way for liberation. This teaching encapsulated the essence of the Buddha's message, the importance of cultivating wisdom, mindfulness, and self-awareness in all aspects of life. Another notable story related to Rahula is his request for ordination. As a young boy, Rahula approached the Buddha and asked for permission to become a monk, seeking to follow in his father's footsteps. The Buddha accepted Rahula into the Sangha, and the boy became one of the youngest monks in the community. Despite his age, Rahula's commitment to the path of enlightenment was unwavering. He practiced diligently, embodying the teachings of his father in his daily life. This story is significant not only because it highlights the Buddha's compassionate acceptance of his son into the community, but also because it shows that the path to enlightenment is open to all, regardless of age or status. Rahula's story is one of devotion, discipline, and the transformative power of the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha's return to his family also sparked broader reflections on the nature of relationships in the Buddhist context. In Buddhism, relationships are not viewed through the lens of ownership or possessiveness. Instead, they are seen as opportunities for growth, compassion, and mutual understanding. The Buddha's interactions with his family members were a perfect example of how relationships can serve as a path to liberation, provided that one approaches them with mindfulness and wisdom. The Buddha taught that true love and compassion are not about clinging to others, but about offering them the space to grow and discover their own paths. This was a revolutionary perspective in a time and place where familial bonds were often seen as the primary source of meaning in life. As the Buddha continued to teach and spread his message, his family became a symbol of the possibility for transformation and awakening. His teachings on the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the nature of suffering and impermanence resonated deeply with his family members, who began to see the world through a new lens. King Suddhodana, in particular, came to realize that his attachment to the material world had been the root of his own suffering. The Buddha's return to his family marked not just a physical reunion, but a reunion of minds and hearts, as each family member, in their own way, began to embrace the teachings of the Dharma. A famous story connected to the Buddha's return to Kapilavastu is the encounter with the courtesan Ambapali, who was known for her beauty and wealth. Ambapali had heard of the Buddha's teachings and, after hearing a sermon, became deeply moved. She invited the Buddha and his disciples to her home, offering them a feast. The Buddha, through his interaction with Mbapali, demonstrated the importance of detachment from the fleeting pleasures of the world. He taught her that while material wealth and beauty are impermanent, the cultivation of wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness leads to true peace and liberation. Mbapali eventually became a devoted follower of the Buddha, marking another example of the Buddha's ability to reach and transform people from all walks of life, whether they were kings, merchants, or courtesans. The Buddha's return to his homeland also marked a turning point in the spread of his teachings. It was during this period that the Buddha began to establish the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns, more formally. He taught that the Sangha was not just a group of people who followed a set of teachings, but a community bound together by a shared commitment to the path of awakening. The Sangha became a living example of the Buddha's teachings, where the principles of generosity, morality, meditation, and wisdom were practiced and nurtured. In this way, the Buddha's return to his homeland was not just a reunion with family, but a reaffirmation of his commitment to share the teachings of enlightenment with all beings. It was a reminder that the path to liberation is open to everyone, regardless of their past, their social status, or their familial relationships. Through his wisdom, compassion, and dedication to the truth, the Buddha showed that the possibility of awakening is within everyone, and that through mindful practice, one can transcend suffering and experience the profound peace of liberation. In the years following his enlightenment, the Buddha recognized the importance of creating a community of practitioners who could not only support each other on the path to awakening, but also carry on his teachings for generations to come. This marked the beginning of the formation of the Sangha, the monastic order that would play a crucial role in preserving and spreading the Dharma. The Sangha would not only be a source of spiritual guidance, but also serve as a living example of the principles of the Buddha's teachings, demonstrating to the world that liberation is attainable through disciplined practice and ethical conduct. The establishment of the Sangha was, in many ways, a revolutionary move in the context of ancient India. In a society where caste and social status defined one's place in the world, the Buddha's monastic order transcended these divisions. The Sangha was open to all people, regardless of their background, wealth, or social rank. Whether a prince, a merchant, a farmer, or an outcast, all could be accepted into the order if they were committed to the path of enlightenment. This inclusivity was one of the core teachings of Buddhism, emphasizing that true liberation is not dependent on external circumstances, but on one's internal transformation. The first step in forming the Sangha was the ordination of the Buddha's early followers. These individuals had heard the Buddha's teachings and were inspired by his wisdom and compassion. Among them were the first 5 disciples whom he had met in the deer park in Sarnath, who had once practiced extreme asceticism alongside him, but had come to understand the middle path through the Buddha's guidance. These 5 disciples were the first to be formally ordained, marking the beginning of the community of monks who would devote their lives to the practice of the Dharma. One of the earliest stories about the establishment of the Sangha involves the ordination of the Buddha's cousin, Ananda. Ananda was a dedicated and loyal companion to the Buddha, and his ordination was significant in the early days of the Sangha. Ananda became one of the Buddha's most important disciples, not only because of his personal devotion, but also because of his role in preserving the teachings. Ananda is famously known for having memorized many of the Buddha's discourses, ensuring that they would be passed down after the Buddha's death. His dedication to the teachings and his close relationship with the Buddha made him one of the most revered figures in Buddhist history. Another notable story surrounding the formation of the Sangha involves the Buddha's interaction with his own family members. After the Buddha's return to his hometown of Kapilavastu, he invited his relatives to join the monastic community. His father, King Suddhodana, and his stepmother, Queen Yasodhara, were initially hesitant to join the Sangha, as they were attached to their royal life and the comforts of the palace. However, after hearing the Buddha's teachings, they both came to realize that true peace could only be found through renunciation of worldly attachments. Eventually, both his father and his stepmother, along with other family members, became ordained monks and nuns, demonstrating that the path to enlightenment was open to all, even those with the deepest attachments. The story of the Buddha's stepmother, Yasodhara, is particularly poignant. She had been deeply affected by her son Rahula's departure to join the Buddha's monastic order, and had initially struggled with the idea of renouncing her royal status. However, when she realized the suffering inherent in attachment, she chose to ordain as a nun, symbolizing her understanding of the transitory nature of life. Yasodhara's story highlights the profound insight that the Buddha's teachings offer, not just as an intellectual understanding, but as a transformative experience that leads to inner peace and liberation. As the Sangha grew, the Buddha began to establish guidelines and precepts for the monastic order. These rules, known as the Vinaya, provided a structure for monastic life and ensured that the practice of the Dharma was upheld with integrity and discipline. The Vinaya emphasized ethical conduct, meditation, and the cultivation of wisdom. It was not just a set of rules for the monks to follow, but a blueprint for living a life of mindfulness and compassion. The rules of the Sangha were designed to help practitioners live harmoniously and with awareness, minimizing distractions, and focusing on the path to enlightenment. The Buddha's approach to the formation of the Sangha was not one of authoritarian control, but of compassionate guidance. He understood that the path to awakening was not a solitary journey, but one that required community, support, and shared wisdom. The Sangha was to be a place where individuals could come together to practice the Dharma, support each other in their struggles, and collectively work towards the goal of liberation. The Sangha was founded on the principles of mutual respect, understanding, and care for one another's spiritual well-being. The Buddha also emphasized that the Sangha was not to be seen as an exclusive or hierarchical institution. The teachings of the Buddha were meant to be shared widely, and the Sangha was a vehicle through which the Dharma could be spread to the broader world. This was made clear when the Buddha sent his disciples to various regions to spread the teachings. One of the most famous stories is the sending of the first 5 monks, who were tasked with spreading the Dharma far and wide. These monks, known as the first disciples, became the foundation for the spread of Buddhism beyond the Buddha's immediate circle. The Buddha's vision for the Sangha was inclusive, open, and supportive. He encouraged the monks and nuns to engage with lay people, teaching them the Dharma and showing them the path to liberation. While the monastic community played a central role in preserving the teachings, the Buddha always emphasized that enlightenment was accessible to all, regardless of their social standing or background. This emphasis on inclusivity is one of the cornerstones of Buddhism and has helped it spread across cultures and societies around the world. One of the key principles that the Buddha instilled in the Sangha was the importance of community and interdependence. The Buddha often taught that no one could achieve enlightenment alone. The Sangha was meant to be a source of mutual support, where individuals could come together to practice the Dharma, help each other in times of need, and learn from one another's experiences. The Buddha's teachings emphasize that true liberation is not just an individual achievement, but a collective process. The Sangha was to be a living embodiment of the interconnection between all beings, demonstrating the power of compassion, wisdom, and cooperation. The formation of the Sangha was a critical step in the Buddha's mission to spread the Dharma and ensure its preservation. Through the establishment of a community dedicated to the practice of the teachings, the Buddha created a lasting legacy that would continue to inspire and transform lives for generations to come. The Sangha became the foundation of the Buddhist community, a place where individuals from all walks of life could come together to pursue the path of enlightenment. In this way, the Buddha's formation of the Sangha not only helped preserve the teachings of the Dharma, but also created a living, breathing community that embodied the principles of mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom. The Sangha remains, to this day, a central part of the Buddhist tradition, serving as both a spiritual home for practitioners and a beacon of hope for all who seek liberation from suffering. The Buddha's teachings on compassion, karu, and non-self, anatta, are two of the most profound and transformative aspects of his Dharma. They form the foundation for the path to liberation, leading practitioners to deeper understanding of their own nature and the world around them. These teachings not only offer a way to break free from suffering but also illuminate the path towards wisdom, peace, and enlightenment. In the teachings of the Buddha, compassion is not merely an emotional response to suffering but a deep, active understanding of the interconnectedness of all beings. It is the recognition that all living creatures experience pain, loss, and fear, and that our inherent nature is one of interconnectedness. The Buddha taught that to truly awaken, we must develop compassion for all beings, transcending the boundaries of self-interest and extending our kindness to all, without exception. A well-known story that illustrates the Buddha's teaching on compassion is the story of the monk who was once deeply angered by a fellow monk's harsh words. In this moment, the Buddha advised him to reflect on the nature of suffering and impermanence. Instead of holding on to anger, the Buddha encouraged him to cultivate an attitude of compassion. The teaching here was clear. By embracing compassion, we free ourselves from the chains of anger and hatred, which only bind us to suffering. In one of his most profound discourses, the Buddha described the practice of metta, or loving kindness, which is an extension of compassion. He emphasized that true compassion does not arise out of pity, but from the wisdom that recognizes the shared experience of all beings. When we cultivate metta, we wish for all beings to be free from suffering and to experience happiness, peace, and the cessation of all attachments. This deep, all-encompassing compassion is not limited by boundaries of race, class, or even species. It is universal, and its power to heal is boundless. Compassion also goes hand in hand with the Buddha's teaching on non-self, anatta, a central concept that challenges our deeply held belief in a permanent, independent self. The Buddha taught that what we consider to be self is nothing more than a collection of changing physical and mental phenomena. There is no permanent, unchanging essence that constitutes me or mine. Understanding this truth is essential for breaking free from suffering, for it is our attachment to the idea of a permanent self that leads to the cycle of craving and aversion, and ultimately to the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, known as samsara. One of the most famous stories about the teaching of non-self involves a conversation between the Buddha and a disciple named Vakagata. Vakagata asked the Buddha whether the self exists or does not exist. The Buddha's response was profound. He refused to answer either way, instead offering the disciple the opportunity to directly observe his own experience. By guiding Vakagata to practice mindfulness and investigate his own feelings, the Buddha pointed out that the question of the self is not a theoretical one. It is something that must be realized through personal insight into the impermanence and interdependence of all phenomena. The Buddha's teaching on non-self is a direct challenge to our conceptualization of identity and invites us to look deeper into the nature of reality. The Buddha also taught that attachment to the ego or sense of self creates suffering because it perpetuates the illusion of separation from others. When we cling to the belief that we are separate from the world around us, we create division and conflict. But when we realize that all phenomena are interconnected, we are able to let go of the illusion of a separate, fixed self and cultivate a sense of oneness with all beings. This realization allows us to live in harmony, free from the conflict that arises from self-centered desires. The teaching of non-self is also illustrated by the story of the Buddha's encounter with the man who sought to kill him. One day, a man approached the Buddha with a knife in his hand, ready to strike him down. But the Buddha, knowing that the man's anger and delusion were born of the belief in a permanent, unchanging self, calmly asked him, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man was confused, so the Buddha continued, "Just as you would not accept a gift that you do not want, so too, if you do not accept anger, it has no hold over you." The man, realizing the truth in the Buddha's words, was transformed by this insight and let go of his intention to harm the Buddha. This story emphasizes the power of recognizing the impermanent nature of both our emotions and the world around us, showing that by releasing our attachment to self-centered desires, we free ourselves from suffering. One of the most important teachings that the Buddha gave on the path to awakening is the understanding of how attachment to the self leads to suffering. The idea of a separate, permanent identity is the root cause of much of our suffering in life. We become attached to things, our possessions, our bodies, our status, and when these things change or are threatened, we experience pain and distress. The Buddha's insight into non-self teaches us to recognize the fluid and interconnected nature of all things. Nothing lasts forever, and when we let go of our attachments, we can experience peace and liberation. The Buddha's teaching on compassion and non-self is not simply a theoretical framework, but a practical guide to living with awareness and wisdom. By practicing compassion towards others, we learn to see beyond our own desires and connect with the suffering of the world. And by understanding non-self, we can free ourselves from the grasp of ego and achieve inner peace. Together, these two teachings form the core of the Buddha's path to enlightenment, guiding us to live in harmony with ourselves, others, and the world around us. In the lives of many of the Buddha's disciples, we see examples of how these teachings transformed their lives. The story of the Buddha's former stepmother, Yasodhara, is one such example. After her son Rahula joined the Sangha, Yasodhara was deeply moved by the Buddha's teaching of non-self and renunciation. She, too, chose to give up her royal position and ordain as a nun. This was a radical decision, showing that even those who seemed to have everything in this world could understand the value of letting go of attachment and pursuing spiritual freedom. Another well-known story is that of the laywoman Visakha, who was one of the Buddha's greatest lay supporters. Despite being married with children and managing a household, Visakha's practice of the Dharma and her deep understanding of compassion and non-self led her to become one of the most respected and influential lay practitioners in the Buddhist community. Her ability to balance family life with spiritual practice exemplifies the Buddha's teachings that enlightenment is not reserved for monks and nuns alone, but is accessible to all who sincerely pursue the path. Ultimately, the Buddha's teachings on compassion and non-self offer profound lessons on how to live a life free from suffering. By cultivating compassion for all beings and understanding the impermanent, interconnected nature of life, we can overcome our attachment to the self and attain true peace. This is the essence of the Buddha's path, a path of wisdom, compassion, and freedom from the limitations of the ego. As the Buddha reached the age of 80, he knew that his mission on earth was nearing its end. After spending many years teaching, guiding, and inspiring countless individuals, his body had grown frail, yet his mind remained clear and compassionate. In his final days, he made the decision to give his last teachings, ensuring that the path to liberation would continue long after his physical death. His passing, or parinirvana, was not an end but a transcendence, marking the ultimate realization of the impermanence of all things. The Buddha had always taught that all things are subject to change, including the physical form. His passing was a reminder of the universal law of impermanence, anicca, one of the fundamental truths he had shared with the world. While his followers grieved his departure, the Buddha's own words provided solace, as he had always emphasized that we are all subject to the cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death. Yet, in this impermanence, he also taught that liberation is possible, that we can transcend this cycle through wisdom and compassionate action. In his final moments, the Buddha gathered his closest disciples, and he delivered his last instructions to them. He reminded them that the teachings he had shared were to be preserved and practiced by future generations. He urged them to rely on the Dharma, the teachings, and not to become attached to the physical form of the teacher, for the true refuge lies in the understanding and practice of the truths he had revealed. "Be a light unto yourselves," he said. "Seek no external refuge, and let the Dharma be your guide." Before passing, the Buddha was asked by his disciple Ananda whether there was anything he should do after the Buddha's death. The Buddha's answer was simple yet profound. He told Ananda that the Dharma, the universal truth he had shared, was the true teacher. "The Dharma is the light," he said, "and it will guide you in your practice. It will remain with you, even after my passing." This final teaching was a message of empowerment to his followers. The Buddha encouraged them to not become dependent on his physical presence, but rather to deepen their understanding of the Dharma and to rely on their own wisdom and compassion. He emphasized that each individual has the potential for enlightenment, and the path to liberation is not bound to the teacher alone, but is accessible through diligent practice and the realization of the truths within. A famous story from the Buddha's final days involves his disciple, Ananda, who was deeply distraught at the thought of the Buddha's passing. Ananda, who had spent many years serving the Buddha, was particularly troubled because he had not asked the Buddha to appoint a successor. Yet, the Buddha reassured him, saying that it was not necessary for someone to take his place, as the teachings themselves would continue to guide all who sought the path. His departure would not signal the end of the Dharma. It would, in fact, be the beginning of a new phase, one in which the teachings would spread and continue to flourish. The Buddha's passing is often compared to the final flame of a candle flickering out. In the moment of his parinirvana, it was as if the flame of his life had completed its course, but the light of the Dharma continued to shine. The metaphor of the candle illustrates the Buddha's teachings on impermanence and the understanding that all things must come to an end. However, even in the cessation, there is no true death, there is only transformation. The Buddha's life was a living embodiment of the path to liberation, and though he left his physical body, his teachings continue to inspire and illuminate the way for countless beings. One of the most significant aspects of the Buddha's passing is the deep sense of equanimity and peace that he demonstrated in his final moments. While those around him may have been overcome with sadness, the Buddha remained calm, fully aware of the natural process of life and death. His ability to accept the impermanence of his own body is a profound lesson in detachment, not from life itself, but from the fear and attachment that often accompany the thought of death. There is a famous story of the Buddha's final words, spoken just before he entered Nirvana. All things are subject to change. Strive on with diligence. These words encapsulate the core of his teachings. Everything in life, be it suffering or joy, birth or death, is impermanent. The path to liberation lies not in avoiding change or resisting the inevitable, but in embracing it with wisdom and diligence. The Buddha's final instruction was a call to action, to continue practicing, to continue striving for understanding, and to live according to the Dharma, no matter the circumstances. The Buddha's passing also marked a turning point in the development of the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns who followed his teachings. Without the Buddha's physical presence, the responsibility to preserve and spread the Dharma fell to his disciples. In the years following his death, the Sangha would convene to organize the teachings, preserving the Buddha's words through oral tradition and later through written texts. This process was crucial in ensuring that the teachings of the Buddha would endure for generations, providing a clear path for future followers to walk. The Buddha's death is often viewed as a final act of teaching. By showing that even the greatest of beings must eventually face death, he imparted the most essential lesson of all, that liberation is not a means of avoiding death, but of understanding it. Through wisdom, compassion, and practice, we can transcend the fear and suffering associated with the inevitable end of life. In this way, the Buddha's passing became an invitation to deepen our practice, to reflect on the impermanence of all things, and to live fully in accordance with the Dharma. The Buddha's life and teachings continue to inspire millions of people around the world. His passing was not an end, but a reminder that the true refuge lies not in the physical presence of a teacher, but in the living wisdom of the Dharma itself. His message is as relevant today as it was over 2,000 years ago, that through understanding the impermanence of life and the nature of suffering, we can find peace and liberation from the cycle of birth and death. In the final moments of the Buddha's life, he showed the world that death, like life, is part of the natural flow of existence. There is no need to fear it, for it is simply another step in the journey of transformation. The Buddha's teachings on impermanence, compassion, and wisdom are the light that continues to guide us long after his physical form has passed. Through diligent practice, we too can walk the path of liberation, following the example set by the Buddha, and realizing the peace that comes from understanding the true nature of existence. The story of the Buddha did not end with his passing. Rather, it marked the beginning of a legacy that would span across centuries and continents. The teachings he imparted, the truths he revealed, and the compassionate example he set continue to inspire and guide countless generations, spreading far beyond the borders of India, where his journey began. Today, the Buddha's legacy lives on, not only in the monasteries and meditation halls, but also in the hearts and minds of millions around the world, providing a beacon of hope and a path to liberation for those seeking to free themselves from suffering. The Buddha's teachings, encapsulated in the Dharma, provided a universal framework for understanding the nature of suffering, dukkha, and the path to its cessation. The core principles, such as the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the concept of impermanence, resonate with people from all walks of life, regardless of cultural or religious background. This universality is one of the reasons why Buddhism has spread so widely, adapting to the cultures and societies it has encountered while maintaining its essence. The first major spread of Buddhism outside of India occurred during the reign of Emperor Ashoka, who ruled India in the 3rd century BCE. Emperor Ashoka, deeply moved by the Buddha's teachings, embraced Buddhism and made it the state religion. His efforts to spread the Dharma included building stupas, Buddhist monuments, sending missionaries to neighboring regions, and offering patronage to monastic communities. One of the most famous stories related to Ashoka is his conversion after witnessing the horrors of war. In the aftermath of a brutal conquest, Ashoka was filled with remorse and turned to the Buddha's teachings, dedicating himself to nonviolence and compassion. His transformation exemplifies the transformative power of Buddhism and its ability to bring about profound change in both individuals and societies. Buddhism spread from India to Central Asia, China, and beyond is marked by the adaptation of the teachings to various cultures. In China, Buddhism became interwoven with Taoism and Confucianism, resulting in unique schools of thought such as Chan Buddhism, which later evolved into Zen Buddhism in Japan. The story of Bodhidharma, the legendary Indian monk who brought Chan Buddhism to China in the 6th century, is one of the most iconic tales of this cross-cultural transmission. Bodhidharma's teaching emphasized meditation as the direct path to enlightenment, and his famous encounter with Emperor Wu of Liang highlighted the profound simplicity of Buddhism. When Emperor Wu asked him about the merit of his good deeds, Bodhidharma famously replied, "There is no merit, no good deeds. Only mind is the problem." Bodhidharma's words resonated deeply with the Chinese, and his teachings gave rise to the Zen school, which continues to influence both Eastern and Western thought today. Zen Buddhism emphasizes direct experience and meditation over scripture or ritual, underscoring the importance of realizing one's true nature through personal insight rather than intellectual understanding. Zen has become an influential part of modern spiritual practice worldwide, illustrating the ongoing relevance of the Buddha's teachings across cultures and time periods. As Buddhism spread to Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia, it continued to evolve, integrating local traditions while preserving the essence of the Buddha's message. In Japan, various schools of Buddhism flourished, such as Pure Land Buddhism, which focuses on the practice of devotion to Amitabha Buddha and the aspiration for rebirth in the Western Pure Land, a realm free from suffering. In contrast, the Nichiren school of Buddhism, founded by the 13th century monk Nichiren, emphasized the chanting of the Lotus Sutra as the most effective means of attaining enlightenment. These diverse interpretations of the Buddha's teachings demonstrate how the Dharma can adapt to different cultural contexts, while still preserving its core principles of compassion, wisdom, and the path to liberation. In Southeast Asia, Theravada Buddhism, which traces its lineage directly back to the earliest teachings of the Buddha, has flourished in countries such as Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Theravada emphasizes the monastic path and the study of the Pali Canon, believed to be the closest record of the Buddha's original words. The monastic tradition is still a vital part of Buddhist life in these countries, where laypeople support the monastic community and, in return, benefit from teachings, meditation, and guidance. Stories from Theravada Buddhism, such as those of famous monks like Ajahn Chah and the Dalai Lama, inspire people to cultivate wisdom and compassion through daily practice and mindfulness. One of the most profound aspects of the Buddha's legacy is the emphasis on individual responsibility for one's spiritual growth. The Buddha himself repeatedly stated that we are our own saviors and that each person must walk the path to liberation through their own effort. This message is encapsulated in the words of the Dhammapada, a collection of sayings attributed to the Buddha. You yourself must strive. The Buddhas only point the way. The Buddha's teachings stress the importance of mindfulness, meditation, ethical conduct, and wisdom in the pursuit of enlightenment. They invite each person to look inward and take responsibility for their own awakening, providing a universal path to transcend suffering. In modern times, the Buddha's teachings continue to inspire people of all backgrounds. The rise of mindfulness meditation in the West, for example, has brought many to explore the profound insights of Buddhism. Mindfulness, as taught by the Buddha, is a practice that cultivates awareness of the present moment, helping individuals to break free from the cycle of craving and aversion that perpetuates suffering. Scientific studies have shown the benefits of mindfulness for mental health, emotional regulation, and overall well-being, further demonstrating the relevance of the Buddha's teachings in today's world. In addition to mindfulness, the Buddha's teachings on compassion and interdependence are gaining increasing recognition in contemporary society. The idea that all beings are interconnected and that our actions have consequences on others resonates with modern concerns about environmental sustainability, social justice, and the interconnectedness of all life. The Buddha's message that suffering arises from ignorance, attachment, and the belief in a separate self is particularly pertinent in today's world, where divisiveness and conflict continue to cause suffering. By practicing compassion, generosity, and wisdom, we can begin to alleviate not only our own suffering but also the suffering of others. The legacy of the Buddha is not only in the teachings that have been passed down through generations, but also in the lived experience of those who follow the path he laid out. The countless stories of individuals who have found peace, healing, and liberation through Buddhism, whether in monastic settings, in temples, or in the daily lives of ordinary people, illustrate the enduring power of the Buddha's message. From the stories of early disciples like Ananda and Sariputta to modern-day teachers such as Thich Nhat Hanh and the Dalai Lama, the Buddha's teachings continue to guide those who seek the truth and wish to end the cycle of suffering. Ultimately, the legacy of the Buddha is a living tradition, one that continues to evolve and adapt to the needs of each generation. Through his teachings, the Buddha has left humanity with a timeless path to wisdom, compassion, and liberation. His life and words remain a source of inspiration and guidance for anyone seeking to live a life of peace, understanding, and enlightenment. And as long as there are beings who seek to end suffering, the Buddha's teachings will continue to illuminate the way. Thank you for joining us on Wisdom of the Buddha. We hope our content brings clarity, peace, and inspiration to your journey. If you find value in our videos, please like, share, and subscribe to stay connected with new insights and teachings. Remember, The path to wisdom and compassion is one of daily practice and self-discovery. Until next time, may you be happy, may you be peaceful, and may you be free from suffering. After leaving the comforts of the palace, Siddhartha entered a life of renunciation, shedding his princely robes for the simple clothing of an ascetic. This marked the beginning of a profound spiritual journey, one in which he sought the ultimate truth to liberate himself and all beings from suffering. It was a path filled with challenges, as he traversed through various practices, searching for the answers that would lead him to enlightenment. Siddhartha's first steps on this path led him to the renowned spiritual teachers of the time, Gautama and Attain. Both were well known for their teachings on meditation and deep states of mental concentration, or samadhi. Gautama taught Siddhartha how to enter profound meditative states, where the mind could transcend the material world and experience a sense of boundless space and infinite consciousness. Attain, on the other hand, guided him to reach a higher state of meditative absorption, one that involved merging with the vast, formless realm of nothingness. Siddhartha, having mastered these techniques, achieved great peace in these meditative states, but something was still missing. Despite his deep experiences, he felt that they did not offer the final liberation he sought. Siddhartha realized that while these practices could calm the mind and offer temporary respite from the suffering of the world, they did not address the root causes of suffering: ignorance, attachment, and craving. He understood that achieving inner peace was not enough if one did not also understand the nature of existence itself and the path to transcend it. This realization led Siddhartha to abandon the extreme asceticism he had practiced for several years, as well as the teachings of Gautama and Attain. He had spent so much time in physical austerities, fasting and depriving his body of nourishment, in an attempt to conquer the physical and mental limitations of the self. However, after exhausting his energy through extreme practices, he came to the critical insight that the body and mind require balance to function optimally. He discovered that excessive hardship and self-inflicted pain did not bring him closer to enlightenment, but only served to weaken his body and cloud his judgment. This moment of realization is pivotal in the Buddha's journey and serves as the foundation of what would later be called the middle way, a balanced approach to spiritual practice that avoids the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification. The middle way calls for moderation in all things, a path of ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom. It emphasizes a balanced life, where one does not reject the body, but rather nourishes it to support the pursuit of mental and spiritual clarity. One story that perfectly encapsulates the Buddha's discovery of the middle way is the story of the lute string. As Siddhartha sat under the Bodhi tree, reflecting on his path, he recalled a time when he had tried to tune a stringed instrument as a child. He remembered that if the string was too loose, it would not produce a sound, and if it was too tight, it would snap. He realized that the practice of spiritual life was much the same. If it was too lax or too extreme, it would not lead to the harmonious inner peace he sought. The string needed to be tuned just right, and so too did his spiritual path. This insight changed Siddhartha's approach to meditation and life. He understood that true enlightenment required a mind that was sharp yet at peace, a body that was healthy and strong, and a spirit that was free from attachments. He decided to take a simpler approach, focusing on meditation, mindfulness, and cultivating insight into the nature of reality. The Buddha would later teach that the path to liberation involves developing wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. These three components, known as the threefold path, are essential to achieving nirvana, the ultimate liberation from suffering. During his period of self-exploration, Siddhartha also encountered the story of the Buddha to be, the Bodhisattva, who is often depicted in early Buddhist texts as someone with immense compassion and a strong desire to relieve the suffering of others. The Bodhisattva path is one of great selflessness, being motivated not only by the desire for one's own enlightenment, but also the awakening of all beings. The Bodhisattva vow is a commitment to help others along the path to liberation, recognizing that the ultimate goal of enlightenment is not a solitary one, but one that benefits all sentient beings. This compassion became central to Siddhartha's own understanding of the path. His initial resolve to seek the truth was not driven by a desire for personal gain, but rather by the compassionate wish to understand suffering in its entirety, so that it could be alleviated for all beings. His journey of self-realization, therefore, was not only an individual quest, but one that was intertwined with the well-being of all sentient beings. One of the most famous stories of the Buddha's compassion is that of his encounter with the sick and suffering. In the Buddhist scriptures, it is told that the Buddha, after his enlightenment, spent years traveling across India, teaching the Dharma and helping those in need. He never turned anyone away, no matter their condition. One of the most touching stories is the tale of the Buddha's meeting with a woman named Gautama, who had lost her child. In her grief, Gautama sought the Buddha's help, and the Buddha told her to gather mustard seeds from a household where no one had ever died. She went from house to house, but found that every home had experienced death. The realization that death is a universal experience helped Gautama come to terms with her sorrow. The Buddha's response taught that suffering is part of life and that the impermanence of life is something to be understood, not feared. Throughout his life, the Buddha emphasized that suffering, dukkha, is an inherent part of existence, and that by understanding its causes, we can free ourselves from it. His path was not about avoiding suffering, but about understanding its nature and learning how to transcend it. The Buddha's compassion and wisdom shine through in every interaction, teaching his followers that through mindfulness, meditation, and ethical living, it is possible to alleviate suffering not only for oneself but for all beings. In the early stages of his journey, Siddhartha faced immense obstacles, both external and internal, as he searched for the truth. Yet, he remained unwavering in his commitment to the path of enlightenment. His story is a powerful reminder that the search for truth requires both courage and perseverance. His journey was not easy, but through it, he uncovered the deepest insights into the nature of suffering, impermanence, and the path to freedom. In his relentless pursuit of enlightenment, Siddhartha made a bold and rigorous decision to undertake extreme ascetic practices. For 6 long years, he subjected himself to the most severe physical deprivations. He fasted for extended periods, limiting his food intake to the barest minimum, and practiced harsh self-mortifications in an attempt to conquer the body and transcend worldly attachments. His goal was clear: to break free from the cycle of suffering, samsara, and achieve liberation by overcoming the physical limitations of the body and the mind's cravings. Siddhartha's ascetic period was marked by extreme austerity. He engaged in practices that caused him to lose strength and vitality, living on only a few grains of rice or a handful of seeds every day, all the while depriving his body of the nourishment it needed to sustain itself. His body became gaunt, weak, and emaciated. He endured such suffering in silence, believing that this physical agony would help him reach the spiritual heights he longed for. He meditated for hours on end, focusing all his energy on achieving a state of perfect mindfulness and self-control, hoping that by breaking the ties to his physical existence, he would reach a higher plane of consciousness. During this time, Siddhartha was surrounded by a group of like-minded ascetics who shared his belief that extreme deprivation was the path to spiritual enlightenment. They admired his discipline and determination, but they, too, were misguided in their understanding of the true path. Siddhartha believed that by mastering the physical realm, he could transcend the limitations of the human condition. He thought that if he could endure the greatest pain and suffering, he would be able to gain insight into the nature of suffering itself and reach ultimate liberation. However, after years of practicing extreme asceticism, Siddhartha began to realize that this path was not leading him to the answers he sought. In fact, the more he denied his body, the more disconnected he became from his true nature. The deprivation weakened his body and mind, making it harder for him to concentrate and meditate deeply. Rather than bringing him closer to enlightenment, the ascetic practices drained his energy and left him feeling more distant from his goal. Siddhartha came to understand that the search for enlightenment through self-inflicted suffering was flawed. Extreme deprivation was not the solution, and he was no closer to achieving the peace and clarity he sought. In this moment of deep reflection, Siddhartha realized that true liberation could not be found by rejecting the body or indulging in its desires. The path to enlightenment lay not in extremes, but in balance and moderation. This insight led Siddhartha to abandon the ascetic practices and turn away from the path of self-mortification. He recognized that a mind weakened by deprivation would be incapable of penetrating the deeper truths of existence. He needed strength, not weakness, in order to attain true understanding. This realization marks a pivotal turning point in Siddhartha's journey. He had already rejected the luxurious life of the palace and the distractions of worldly pleasures, and now he understood that self-inflicted pain and austerity were also not the way forward. The middle way, his path of balanced living, began to take shape in his mind. Siddhartha knew that he needed to nourish both his body and mind, for it was only when both were in harmony that true understanding could arise. One of the most important stories that reflects this shift in Siddhartha's understanding is his encounter with Sujata, a woman who offered him food. At this point, Siddhartha was near death from extreme fasting, and he was so weak that he could barely move. Sujata, seeing his condition, offered him a bowl of rice milk, which he gratefully accepted. This moment was profound, as it symbolized a return to balance. By accepting nourishment, Siddhartha was no longer rejecting the body, but rather embracing the principle of moderation. He realized that while renunciation of worldly pleasures was necessary for spiritual progress, neglecting the body's basic needs only led to further suffering and spiritual stagnation. This turning point in Siddhartha's life is significant not only for his personal journey, but also for the core teachings that he would later share with the world. He began to understand that life was not about avoiding pleasure or pain, but about transcending attachment to both. The middle way, as he later named it, would become the foundation of his teachings, emphasizing moderation in all things. It is a path that seeks to avoid the extremes of indulgence and deprivation, recognizing that both contribute to suffering. The Buddhist teachings related to the middle way are grounded in the principle of the Four Noble Truths, which Siddhartha would come to teach after his enlightenment. These truths outline the nature of suffering, its causes, the possibility of its cessation, and the path leading to that cessation. The middle way lies at the heart of these teachings, offering a balanced and pragmatic approach to the human condition. One of the key aspects of Siddhartha's realization during this period is the recognition that suffering is an inherent part of life, but it is not something to be avoided or ignored. Instead, suffering should be understood, embraced, and transcended through wisdom and insight. In this context, the idea of embracing suffering is not about passively enduring pain, but about understanding its nature, why it arises, how it affects us, and how we can move beyond it. A famous story in Buddhist tradition is the tale of the Buddha's first sermon, in which he taught the 5 precepts, the 4 noble truths, and the Eightfold Path. These teachings, which form the foundation of Buddhist practice, are deeply connected to the insights Siddhartha gained during his period of asceticism. They highlight the importance of ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom in overcoming suffering and attaining enlightenment. Another significant story during this stage of Siddhartha's life is his encounter with Mara, the demon of illusion, who tried to distract Siddhartha from his path. As Siddhartha meditated under the Bodhi tree, Mara appeared to him in various forms, tempting him with pleasures, distractions, and fears. Mara's goal was to prevent Siddhartha from attaining enlightenment by luring him away from his focus. But Siddhartha, having gained clarity through his practice and his understanding of the middle way, saw through Mara's illusions. He was no longer attached to the fleeting pleasures of the world, nor was he afraid of the challenges that lay ahead. In this victory over Mara, Siddhartha demonstrated the power of inner peace and insight to overcome the forces of distraction and suffering. The experience of extreme asceticism and the subsequent realization that this path was not leading to enlightenment were essential for Siddhartha's spiritual growth. They served as a reminder that true wisdom comes not from rejecting the body or indulging in the senses, but from transcending attachment to both. Siddhartha's path to enlightenment was not about abandoning life, but about embracing the fullness of life with wisdom, balance, and compassion. The ascetic stage of Siddhartha's life serves as a crucial teaching in Buddhism. It reminds practitioners that the pursuit of enlightenment is not about extremes, but about finding the middle ground. It is a path of balance, of understanding the nature of suffering and how to transcend it through mindful awareness and compassionate action. Siddhartha's journey teaches us that the way to liberation is not through rejecting the world, but through understanding it deeply and acting with wisdom and compassion in every moment. After 6 long years of rigorous ascetic practices, Siddhartha came to the profound realization that the extreme self-denial he had subjected himself to had not brought him any closer to enlightenment. Instead, it had only weakened his body and clouded his mind, making it even more difficult to find clarity and peace. It was through this experience that he understood that extreme paths, whether of indulgence in pleasures or of self-mortification, were both ultimately unfruitful in achieving liberation. He knew that the key to attaining true wisdom lay not in the extremes, but in a balanced approach. Thus, Siddhartha arrived at his pivotal decision to follow the middle way. The middle way is a path that lies between the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification, offering a balanced approach to life and spiritual practice. It is not about rejecting the world entirely, nor about surrendering to every desire or craving. Rather, it is about living mindfully, with awareness and wisdom, understanding the impermanence of all things, and finding harmony in every aspect of life. The middle way transcends the dualities of pleasure and pain, attachment and detachment, through the cultivation of right understanding, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Siddhartha's decision to embrace the middle way marked the turning point in his spiritual journey. It was not a compromise, but a realization that true freedom comes from understanding the nature of suffering and the path to its cessation. As he walked away from the ascetic practices, he chose to nourish both his body and mind, understanding that the balance between the two was essential for the cultivation of wisdom and insight. He sought to free himself from the clutches of both physical indulgence and unnecessary hardship, instead embracing a life of moderation. In this period of transition, Siddhartha found a new sense of clarity and peace. He understood that the purpose of life was not to renounce the world but to understand it more deeply, to see through its illusions, and to experience it fully without attachment or aversion. The middle way was not just a set of practices, but a perspective on life itself. It was about finding the right relationship to the world, to others, and to oneself. One famous story in Buddhism that exemplifies the middle way is that of the Buddha's encounter with the musician. The musician, in teaching his student how to play the sitar, explained that the string must not be too tight or too loose. It must be perfectly balanced to create the right tone. This story symbolically illustrates the concept of the middle way. Like the string of the sitar, one must find the right balance between the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification in order to find true harmony and peace. Siddhartha's acceptance of the middle way was a profound shift in his understanding of the spiritual path. He realized that the body and mind must be in harmony to attain wisdom, and this harmony could only be achieved through moderation. He now understood that the path to liberation required mindfulness and awareness in each moment, regardless of external circumstances. The middle way is also intricately connected to the Four Noble Truths, which Siddhartha would later teach after his enlightenment. The Four Noble Truths explain that suffering is an inherent part of existence, that its cause is attachment and craving, that suffering can be overcome, and that the path to its cessation is through the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path, in essence, is the practical application of the middle way. It provides a clear framework for living a life that leads to wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. The Eightfold Path consists of 8 factors: right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These factors represent the path of moderation and balance, avoiding extremes in thought, word, and action. They emphasize the importance of developing right view and right intention, which lay the foundation for ethical conduct and mental discipline. One of the key aspects of the middle way is the cultivation of right mindfulness. This involves being fully present in each moment and aware of one's thoughts, feelings, and actions. It is about observing the impermanent nature of everything without attachment or aversion. The practice of mindfulness allows one to develop a clear understanding of the nature of suffering, its causes, and how it can be overcome. It is through mindfulness that one can begin to cultivate the wisdom needed to break free from the cycle of craving and suffering. Another important aspect of the middle way is the concept of non-attachment. Attachment to things, people, and experiences is what causes suffering in the world. The more attached we are, the more we suffer when those things change or disappear. By practicing non-attachment, one learns to let go of the need for things to be a certain way. This doesn't mean rejecting life or becoming indifferent, but rather it means engaging with life fully, without clinging to the outcomes or expectations. Siddhartha's journey into the middle way was not simply a personal transformation. It was a deep shift in his understanding of the nature of life itself. He began to see that the root cause of suffering was not external circumstances, but the way in which we relate to those circumstances. It is our attachment to desires, our aversion to pain, and our inability to accept impermanence that causes our suffering. A well-known story that illustrates the concept of the middle way is that of the Buddha's teachings to his followers. Once, he was asked by a group of monks about the nature of suffering and how to attain liberation. In response, he outlined the middle way as the path to freedom from suffering, emphasizing that wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline were the essential elements of this path. This teaching became the cornerstone of the Buddhist path and is still studied and practiced by millions around the world today. The Buddha's journey and his discovery of the middle way offer a profound lesson for us all. The extremes of life, whether in pleasure or pain, are not where true peace can be found. Instead, we must learn to find balance, to cultivate mindfulness, and to let go of our attachments in order to attain the peace and clarity that comes from understanding the true nature of existence. As Siddhartha began his new journey down the middle way, he recognized that this path was not just for him, but for all beings. He understood that enlightenment could not be attained by isolating oneself from the world, nor could it be achieved by indulgence in worldly pleasures. The middle way, then, is the path that leads to true liberation, freedom from suffering, freedom from craving, and freedom from the attachments that bind us to the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. This realization became the foundation for the Buddha's teachings on the path to enlightenment. It was no longer about seeking spiritual heights through deprivation or self-indulgence. Instead, it was about recognizing the impermanent nature of life and cultivating wisdom, compassion, and mindfulness in every aspect of life. Through the middle way, Siddhartha found the true path to liberation, and he would soon go on to share this path with the world, guiding others to their own awakening. Siddhartha's decision to meditate under the Bodhi tree marked the most crucial turning point in his journey. It was beneath this sacred tree, known as the Tree of Enlightenment, that he vowed never to rise until he had discovered the ultimate truth, the nature of suffering, and the path to its cessation. This moment of resolve is deeply symbolic, reflecting the Buddha's commitment to achieving liberation not only for himself, but for all beings caught in the endless cycle of suffering and rebirth. The Bodhi tree became the backdrop for Siddhartha's final battle, his confrontation with the very forces that sought to keep him trapped in ignorance and delusion. As he meditated deeply, he encountered Mara, the demon of illusion and desire. Mara, whose name is often associated with the forces of distraction and temptation, sought to prevent Siddhartha from reaching enlightenment by exploiting his deepest fears and desires. Mara's first tactic was to question Siddhartha's right to enlightenment, suggesting that he was not worthy and that his efforts would be in vain. Mara attempted to sow doubt in Siddhartha's mind, making him question his quest and his ability to succeed. In response, Siddhartha remained unmoved, focused on his meditation, and resolute in his search for truth. Mara then sent his daughters, the embodiments of desire, to seduce Siddhartha and distract him from his path. They danced before him, offering worldly pleasures, but Siddhartha was impervious to their allure. He had already understood the nature of desire and the suffering it caused, and thus he could not be swayed. Mara, frustrated by his failure to deter Siddhartha through temptation, escalated his efforts, sending armies of demons to attack him. The forces of Mara rained arrows upon Siddhartha, but they turned to lotus flowers as they neared him, symbolizing the transformation of suffering into wisdom when seen with a mind free from attachment. Siddhartha's victory over Mara is symbolic not only of the triumph over external forces, but also over the internal battles we all face, our fears, doubts, and desires. In Buddhist philosophy, Mara is often seen as a representation of the ego, the attachment to self, and the illusions that keep one bound to the cycle of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. By overcoming Mara, Siddhartha transcended the illusions of self and ego, leading him to the realization of his true nature. As the night deepened, Siddhartha's mind grew clearer. In his deep meditation, he began to experience profound insights. The first of these was the realization of the Four Noble Truths, the foundational teachings of Buddhism. He understood that suffering is an inherent part of life, that suffering is caused by craving and attachment, that it can be overcome, and that the path to its cessation is through the Eightfold Path. This was not just an intellectual understanding. It was a direct experience of the nature of suffering and the realization that the path to liberation lies in understanding the impermanence of all things and cultivating wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. Siddhartha's enlightenment was not a sudden intellectual insight, but a profound shift in consciousness, a deep, experiential knowing of the interconnectedness of all things, the reality of impermanence, and the non-self, anatta, nature of existence. As the morning star appeared in the sky, Siddhartha achieved the state of Buddhahood. His mind was free from all attachments, desires, and illusions, and he saw the world in its true form, without the distortions of ego or craving. He had transcended the duality of existence and non-existence, life and death, and had become fully awakened to the reality of suffering and its cessation. He had achieved Nirvana, the ultimate state of peace and liberation, where there is no more suffering or rebirth. A well-known Buddhist story that illustrates the nature of Siddhartha's enlightenment is the Bodhisattva's vow. After attaining enlightenment, Siddhartha could have chosen to remain in Nirvana, free from suffering. However, he made a vow to return to the world and help others attain liberation. This vow was the foundation of the Bodhisattva path, a path of compassion, where one seeks enlightenment not only for oneself but for all beings. Siddhartha's decision to become a Buddha and share his wisdom with the world was motivated by his deep compassion for all beings trapped in suffering. The story of the Buddha's meditation under the Bodhi tree also emphasizes the importance of perseverance and commitment on the spiritual path. In Buddhism, the journey to enlightenment is not easy, and it requires dedication, patience, and the willingness to face one's deepest fears and attachments. Siddhartha's resolve to sit under the Bodhi tree, despite the temptations and obstacles he faced, serves as a reminder that the path to wisdom requires steadfast determination. In Buddhist practice, the story of the Bodhi tree and the Buddha's enlightenment serves as an inspiration for all practitioners. It reminds them that the ultimate truth is within reach, but it requires sustained effort, mindfulness, and the courage to face one's inner obstacles. Just as the Buddha sat beneath the tree, practitioners today sit in meditation to cultivate clarity and insight, gradually overcoming the distractions and illusions that cloud their minds. The symbolism of the Bodhi tree is deeply significant in Buddhism. The tree itself is said to represent the tree of wisdom, the place where the Buddha attained enlightenment. In Buddhist art, the Bodhi tree is often depicted with a large, spreading canopy of leaves, symbolizing the vastness of wisdom and the shelter it provides to all beings. The tree also represents the interconnectedness of all things, as it provides sustenance and shelter to the surrounding environment, just as wisdom nourishes and supports the spiritual growth of individuals. Siddhartha's meditation under the Bodhi tree also highlights the importance of mindfulness in Buddhist practice. Mindfulness, or sati, is the practice of being fully present and aware of each moment, without attachment or aversion. It is through mindfulness that one can gain insight into the nature of suffering, its causes, and the path to its cessation. By being mindful of his thoughts, feelings, and sensations, Siddhartha was able to observe the impermanent nature of all things and transcend the illusions that bind beings to samsara. The Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree is not just a historical event, but a living teaching that continues to inspire millions of people around the world. It is a reminder that enlightenment is not something far off or unattainable. It is something that can be realized through dedicated practice and deep insight into the nature of the mind and the world. The Bodhi tree, as a symbol of wisdom, continues to be revered by Buddhists around the world, serving as a reminder of the possibility of awakening for all beings. Thus, Siddhartha's meditation under the Bodhi tree is not just a personal story, but a universal teaching, pointing the way to the potential for liberation that exists within each of us. Through mindfulness, perseverance, and a commitment to the path, we too can awaken to the truth of our existence and transcend the suffering that binds us. On the night of the full moon, Siddhartha attained enlightenment, his mind free from the shackles of ignorance and illusion. In that profound moment, he comprehended the Four Noble Truths with crystal clarity, fully understanding the nature of suffering, its causes, and the path that leads to its cessation. This was the culmination of his years of relentless seeking and meditation under the Bodhi tree. It was here that he broke free from the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, reaching Nirvana, the ultimate state of liberation and peace. The first of the Four Noble Truths that Siddhartha realized was that life, in its essence, is filled with suffering. He saw how suffering is inherent in the human experience. From the moment we are born, we are subject to birth, aging, sickness, and death. These inevitable realities form the backdrop of our existence, and no matter how much wealth, power, or pleasure we accumulate, we are unable to escape the pain of loss, separation, and decay. This universal truth was not a pessimistic view, but a profound observation of the nature of life. The second truth that Siddhartha realized was that the cause of suffering is craving, or tanha. This craving, born of attachment to our desires, is what keeps us bound to the cycle of samsara, the cycle of birth and rebirth. Whether it is craving for sensory pleasures, for material possessions, or for the permanence of things that are inherently impermanent, this desire is the root of all suffering. Siddhartha saw that we continuously chase after fleeting pleasures, believing they will bring us lasting happiness, only to find that they are unsatisfactory and transient. The third truth that arose in Siddhartha's mind was that suffering can be overcome. The realization of the cessation of suffering was a profound breakthrough. Siddhartha recognized that by letting go of craving and attachment, one could free oneself from the chains of samsara. This cessation of suffering is what is called Nirvana, a state of absolute peace, freedom, and liberation, where one is no longer bound by the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. This realization was not abstract or theoretical for Siddhartha. It was a direct and transformative experience of inner peace. The fourth and final truth that Siddhartha discovered was the path that leads to the cessation of suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. This path is a guide for ethical and mental development, and it is the way to attain wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. The Eightfold Path is divided into three core areas: wisdom, right understanding and right intention; ethical conduct, right speech, right action, and right livelihood; and mental discipline, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Each aspect of this path contributes to the transformation of the mind, leading to the cessation of suffering and the attainment of enlightenment. At the moment of his enlightenment, Siddhartha understood not only the truths of human suffering but also the way to transcend it. His realization was profound and complete. He saw that all beings are interconnected, and that the key to liberation is wisdom, ethical conduct, and meditation. He knew that to achieve nirvana, one must transcend the ego, the illusion of a permanent, unchanging self, and realize the true nature of reality, impermanence, suffering, and non-self. This moment of enlightenment is the defining moment of Siddhartha's journey, transforming him into the Buddha, the awakened one. With his newfound wisdom, he understood that his purpose was not just to live in peace, but to share his insights with others, to help them escape suffering and find the path to liberation. He became a teacher, not just of himself, but for all beings, sharing the knowledge he had gained so that others might follow the same path to awakening. A well-known story that highlights the significance of this realization is that of the Buddha's first teaching after his enlightenment, the turning of the wheel of Dharma. Upon attaining enlightenment, the Buddha could have chosen to remain in seclusion, enjoying the peace and freedom he had achieved. However, driven by compassion for all beings, he decided to share his insights with others. He traveled to Sarnath, where he met 5 ascetics whom he had once studied with. These ascetics had been practicing severe forms of self-denial, much like Siddhartha had in his earlier years. At first, they were skeptical of Siddhartha's newfound wisdom, but upon hearing his teachings on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, they were deeply moved. In his first sermon, the Buddha explained that the middle way, the path between the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification, is the path to liberation. This teaching was revolutionary because it offered a balanced approach to spiritual development. The Buddha explained that true liberation comes not from rejecting the world, nor from clinging to it, but from seeing the world as it truly is, free from delusion and attachment. This middle way, which avoids the extremes of indulgence and asceticism, became the foundation of Buddhist practice. One of the most important aspects of the Buddha's realization was the understanding of the interconnectedness of all beings. He saw that suffering is not limited to humans. It extends to all sentient beings. This insight led to the development of the Buddha's compassionate approach to teaching. Rather than viewing himself as a superior being, he considered himself a fellow traveler on the path of liberation, guiding others with wisdom and compassion. His teachings emphasized that anyone, regardless of their background or status, could attain enlightenment if they followed the path he had laid out. Another famous story associated with the Buddha's enlightenment is that of his encounter with the demon Mara, who represents temptation, fear, and the distractions of the worldly life. When Siddhartha sat under the Bodhi tree, Mara attempted to seduce him with pleasures, frighten him with fears, and distract him with illusions. But Siddhartha, through his deep meditation, saw through Mara's illusions and remained focused on his quest for truth. Mara's failed attempts to disturb Siddhartha symbolized the triumph of wisdom over desire and fear. This victory over Mara represents the overcoming of the internal obstacles, such as fear, doubt, and desire, that prevent us from reaching enlightenment. The Buddha's enlightenment also emphasizes the importance of self-reliance. While the Buddha received teachings from various teachers throughout his life, it was only through his own effort and realization under the Bodhi tree that he attained enlightenment. This highlights a central tenet of Buddhism, that the path to liberation is an individual journey. No one can walk the path for us, and no external force can give us enlightenment. It is through our own direct experience, mindfulness, and wisdom that we can uncover the truth and free ourselves from suffering. The Buddha's enlightenment is not a unique event that occurred only once in history. It is a potential that exists within every being. Buddhism teaches that the seed of enlightenment is inherent in all of us, and that through right practice and understanding, we can all awaken to the truth of our existence. The Buddha's path is not exclusive to him. It is a universal path that anyone can follow to reach liberation. Thus, Siddhartha's enlightenment was not just a personal event, but a universal teaching that resonates with all beings. His realization showed that suffering is not inevitable, and that liberation is possible through understanding the nature of reality and the cultivation of wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. The Buddha's journey from a prince seeking pleasure to an awakened teacher offering a path to liberation continues to inspire millions of people today, showing that enlightenment is not just a distant ideal but a living, attainable reality for all. After his profound awakening under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha knew that his understanding of the nature of suffering, its causes, and the path to liberation was not something to be kept to himself. He realized that the essence of his enlightenment, the Four Noble Truths, had the potential to liberate all sentient beings from the endless cycle of suffering, known as samsara. The Buddha, now deeply moved by compassion for all beings, decided to share his realization and the path he had discovered. He embarked on a mission to spread his teachings, knowing that this was his true calling, to lead others out of suffering and towards true peace, just as he had been freed. The Buddha's first sermon after attaining enlightenment is known as the turning of the wheel of Dharma, Dharmachakra Pravartana. This event took place in the Deer Park at Sarnath, where the Buddha met his 5 former companions, the ascetics with whom he had once practiced extreme austerities. These 5 companions had abandoned him when he decided to follow the middle way, abandoning the path of self-mortification. The Buddha approached them, recognizing that they were still searching for the truth, and invited them to listen to his teachings. In his first sermon, the Buddha introduced the Four Noble Truths, which form the foundation of his teachings. He explained the nature of suffering, dukkha, in all its forms, the root cause of suffering and craving and attachment, tanha, the possibility of liberation from suffering through the cessation of craving, and the path that leads to the end of suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. He emphasized that enlightenment was not reserved for a select few, but could be attained by anyone who sincerely followed the path. At first, the 5 ascetics were skeptical of the Buddha's newfound teachings. However, upon hearing the Buddha's words, they began to see the wisdom of his approach. One by one, they each attained different levels of understanding, and they became the Buddha's first disciples. The Buddha's insight into the human condition and his compassionate desire to alleviate suffering touched their hearts. This marked the beginning of the Buddha's role as a teacher, and his first followers became the initial Sangha, the community of monks and nuns who would carry his teachings forward. The conversion of these first disciples was not a simple or automatic process. It took time for them to let go of their old beliefs and practices. But the Buddha's teachings on the nature of suffering and the path to its cessation were revolutionary, and they resonated deeply with those who were seeking a way to end their inner turmoil. Through his teachings, the Buddha showed that suffering is not an inherent part of life, but something that can be understood, transcended, and ultimately overcome through wisdom and the cultivation of ethical conduct and mental discipline. The Buddha's teachings were not just philosophical ideas or abstract concepts, but practical, transformative tools for those who were ready to follow the path. For instance, the Buddha's teaching on the middle way, avoiding the extremes of self-indulgence and self-mortification, was revolutionary in its simplicity and balance. The Buddha demonstrated that enlightenment was not to be sought through denial of the body or excessive indulgence in sensual pleasures, but through the cultivation of a balanced, harmonious life in which wisdom, ethical conduct, and mindfulness guide every action and thought. The Buddha also introduced the concept of anatta, or non-self, challenging the prevailing belief in an eternal, unchanging soul. He taught that all phenomena, including the self, are impermanent and constantly changing. This teaching of non-self, anatta, is central to Buddhist philosophy and emphasizes that attachment to the illusion of a permanent self is the cause of much of human suffering. By letting go of this attachment, one can reach enlightenment and liberation from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. As the Buddha continued his journey of spreading the Dharma, he encountered people from all walks of life, kings and beggars, merchants and soldiers, farmers and priests. His message transcended social class, caste, and occupation, resonating with anyone who was willing to listen with an open mind. One of the Buddha's most famous conversions was that of Angulimala, a notorious bandit who had killed many people. When Angulimala encountered the Buddha, he was struck by the Buddha's calm demeanor and wisdom. Despite his violent past, Angulimala felt a deep sense of remorse and decided to follow the Buddha's teachings. Through his dedication to the path, he transformed his life and ultimately attained enlightenment. Another famous story is that of the Buddha's encounter with the courtesan Amrapali. Amrapali was a renowned beauty in the city of Vaishali, and many sought her favor. However, she was disillusioned with the empty nature of wealth, beauty, and worldly pleasures. Upon hearing about the Buddha, she invited him to her home, hoping to find deeper meaning in life. After listening to the Buddha's teachings, Amrapali was so moved that she renounced her life of luxury and became a devoted follower of the Buddha. This story exemplifies how the Buddha's teachings were not only applicable to the ascetics and the poor, but also to those who lived in wealth and indulgence. The Buddha's teachings spread across the Indian subcontinent, and many followed him, both as lay followers and as ordained monks and nuns. The establishment of the Sangha, the community of monks and nuns, was a crucial part of the Buddha's plan to ensure the longevity and spread of his teachings. The Sangha provided a place for people to practice the Dharma in a supportive and disciplined environment. Monks and nuns followed the Buddha's teachings closely, meditating, studying, and practicing the ethical guidelines he set forth. Over time, the Sangha grew, and monasteries were established across India, allowing the teachings to reach even more people. In spreading his teachings, the Buddha emphasized that his Dharma was a path for all beings, regardless of their background, status, or abilities. He taught that anyone, regardless of caste, could attain enlightenment if they followed the path with diligence, sincerity, and compassion. The Buddha's message of equality and compassion was revolutionary at the time, as the social structure in India was rigid, with many people confined to the lower castes. By inviting all people to follow the path to liberation, the Buddha broke down social barriers and offered a path to true freedom. A significant moment in the Buddha's life came when he addressed King Bimbisara, a powerful ruler who was deeply moved by the Buddha's teachings. The king offered the Buddha a piece of land to build a monastery, and it was here that the Buddha established the first permanent residence for his followers. This monastery, called Velluvana, became a hub for teaching and meditation, and it symbolized the growing influence of the Buddha's teachings. As the Buddha continued to teach and spread the Dharma, his followers grew in number. The Buddha's teachings offered a way out of suffering for those who were willing to follow the path, and many found solace, peace, and enlightenment through his guidance. The Buddha's approach to teaching was marked by his ability to speak to the hearts of individuals, to address their concerns and struggles, and to provide them with practical tools for transformation. The Buddha's mission was clear: to teach the path to liberation, to end suffering, and to guide all beings to enlightenment. His compassionate nature and profound wisdom transformed the lives of countless individuals, and his teachings continue to inspire and guide people to this day. The Buddha's message of peace, wisdom, and compassion remains timeless, transcending cultural, linguistic, and social boundaries. As the Buddha's teachings began to spread across the land, he encountered various obstacles and resistance from individuals, institutions, and societal norms that were firmly rooted in established traditions. Despite the clarity and wisdom of his message, many struggled to accept the profound changes that the Buddha's path called for. The Buddha's insights were radically different from the prevailing religious and philosophical beliefs of his time, and his teachings threatened the status quo. The stronghold of caste systems, rigid social norms, and entrenched religious practices were powerful forces that sought to suppress any challenge to their authority. One of the first major challenges the Buddha faced came from the Brahmin priests and the traditional religious establishment. The Brahmins were the custodians of the religious rituals and sacrifices that were an essential part of Hinduism at the time. These rituals, they believed, were crucial for maintaining cosmic order and securing blessings from the gods. The Buddha, however, did not adhere to the idea that salvation could be bought or achieved through external rituals, sacrifices, or ceremonies. He instead focused on inner purification through wisdom, ethical conduct, and meditation. For the Brahmins, this was a direct threat to their influence and power, as it shifted the focus from external rituals to internal transformation. There are several famous stories that illustrate how the Buddha responded to opposition with patience, wisdom, and compassion. One of the most notable examples is the story of the Buddha's encounter with a group of Brahmins who challenged his teachings. They invited him to a debate, hoping to prove that his teachings were flawed. The Buddha, as was his nature, did not engage in heated arguments or displays of intellectual superiority. Instead, he posed a simple but profound question. If a man who has been wounded by an arrow refuses to let anyone remove it, how will he ever heal? The Brahmins were taken aback by the question, which was a metaphor for the nature of suffering. The Buddha pointed out that it was not enough to engage in intellectual debates about abstract truths. Rather, one must directly address the wounds of suffering in order to heal. This insight led many to question their attachment to external rituals and to look inward for true liberation. In addition to opposition from religious leaders, the Buddha also faced resistance from other ascetics who practiced severe forms of self-mortification and austerities. These ascetics believed that enduring pain and deprivation was the key to spiritual progress. When the Buddha rejected this extreme path and embraced the middle way, these ascetics were critical of his approach, accusing him of abandoning the true path to enlightenment. The Buddha responded to this criticism with gentle wisdom, explaining that neither extreme indulgence nor extreme deprivation leads to true happiness or liberation. He emphasized that the path to enlightenment was one of balance, where wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline work together to bring about peace and understanding. Another key challenge that the Buddha faced came in the form of Mara, the embodiment of temptation, illusion, and evil. Mara sought to obstruct the Buddha's progress by distracting him with physical pleasures, doubts, and fears. Mara's ultimate aim was to prevent the Buddha from achieving enlightenment and sharing his teachings with the world. This struggle between Mara and the Buddha is one of the most iconic moments in Buddhist literature and symbolizes the internal battles that each individual must face on the path to awakening. When the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, fully committed to his quest for enlightenment, Mara attempted to disturb his meditation by sending armies of demons to frighten him and illusions to entice him. But the Buddha remained steadfast, unwavering in his pursuit of the truth. In a final act of desperation, Mara attempted to convince the Buddha that he had no right to attain enlightenment, claiming that the Buddha had not yet earned it. But the Buddha responded with wisdom and compassion, touching the earth with his hand and declaring that the earth itself bore witness to his unshakable commitment to the truth. In this moment, Mara's power dissolved, and the Buddha reached enlightenment. The story of Mara's attempt to deter the Buddha is a profound teaching in itself. It reminds us that the path to enlightenment is often beset with internal and external obstacles. Mara represents the distractions, doubts, and attachments that prevent us from seeing things as they truly are. These internal obstacles can take many forms, including fear, desire, anger, and delusion. The Buddha's ability to overcome Mara teaches us that true liberation comes not through avoiding challenges, but through facing them with clarity, equanimity, and insight. Another significant encounter the Buddha faced was with Devdatta, a cousin of the Buddha and one of his early followers. Devdatta, who was initially an ardent disciple of the Buddha, became increasingly disillusioned and eventually tried to undermine the Buddha's teachings. He believed that the Buddha's teachings were too lenient and that a more extreme form of asceticism should be practiced. Devdatta sought to create a schism in the Sangha by promoting his own interpretation of the path, which involved stricter rules and practices. His actions included attempting to murder the Buddha and causing division within the monastic community. Despite Devdatta's attempts to cause harm, the Buddha responded with great compassion. Rather than retaliate or express anger, the Buddha recognized that Devdatta was a being caught in delusion and suffering, and he treated him with kindness and understanding. The Buddha's response to Devdatta's action serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of nonviolence, even in the face of adversity. The Buddha did not seek to defeat his enemies, but instead sought to transform their minds through understanding and compassion. The Buddha also faced challenges from various political figures and rulers who were wary of the growing influence of his teachings. Some rulers saw the Buddha's teachings as a threat to their authority and the social order, particularly because the Buddha's message emphasized the equality of all beings and the potential for liberation through one's own efforts, rather than through birthright or wealth. However, the Buddha's influence also extended to kings and queens, who were drawn to his wisdom and compassion. Several rulers, such as King Bimbisara and King Ashoka, became great supporters of the Buddha and his teachings. King Ashoka, in particular, played a crucial role in spreading Buddhism throughout India and beyond, helping to establish it as a major world religion. Throughout these challenges, the Buddha's response was always rooted in patience, wisdom, and compassion. His teachings emphasized the importance of cultivating a mind free from attachment, hatred, and ignorance. He taught that suffering arises from our attachment to the transient world, and the way to overcome suffering is through understanding the impermanent nature of all things, practicing mindfulness, and cultivating a compassionate heart. The Buddha's life serves as a powerful example of resilience and the ability to rise above adversity. His ability to face criticism, challenges, and personal attacks with equanimity and wisdom is a central lesson in Buddhist practice. In the face of opposition, the Buddha did not become defensive or angry. Instead, he responded with loving kindness, seeing the potential for awakening in all beings, even those who opposed him. In modern times, the Buddha's teachings on overcoming obstacles are just as relevant. We, too, face difficulties and challenges in our lives, whether external struggles or internal conflicts. By embodying the qualities of patience, mindfulness, and compassion, we can navigate these challenges with grace and clarity, just as the Buddha did. The key is to remember that challenges are not obstacles to our growth, but opportunities to cultivate wisdom and compassion. In the face of adversity, we are called to remain steadfast in our practice, to trust in the path of the Dharma, and to act with a heart of love and understanding for all beings.